What is up, everybody? Welcome to Best Ball Live. My name is Greg Smith. I'm your host at Greg Sauce on Twitter. Joining me this week, the great Chris Allen at Chris Allen FFWX, the weather expert. What's up, Chris?
What's going on, Greg? It's been too long since we've had a chance to sit down, but I know you're a proud papa now. So yes. I'm so glad to finally get a chance to sit down with you after your big life event. But other than that, I mean, I'm happy we get to do this draft tonight. The Superflex thing is still kind of throwing me for a loop because I've just typically done, I mean, for folks that have checked out my work over on 4for4, walking through like best ball drafts, the strategies and whatnot, even though we're on FFPC, it's typically just been their traditional 28 round style, that type of format. So this will be interesting, man. I'm ready to talk through some strategy, and hopefully we find that last person to hop in the draft with us, and we'll figure things out from there.
Yep, we're waiting for one more. Still got 11 people in the queue. We need to get number 12 before the draft will fire. At this point, it looks like it's scheduled to go at 9:45, but every 5 minutes that pass, we're gonna keep getting that start delayed a little bit longer. But we'll fill it soon. I'm sure that we'll have plenty to talk about once the draft is going. But why don't you talk to me a little bit more about what you found for the 1QB best balls over at the FFPC? Because I know you dug deep into that for 4for4.com over the offseason or like earlier this year.
Yeah. So of course, as soon as the Super Bowl got done, I mean, I maybe took like a couple week hiatus, but I couldn't stay too far away from the best ball lobbies. I'm too much of a degenerate at this point. But regardless, go check out my work over at 4for4. I've done positional win rates for quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And also did like the overall roster construction, working on a stacks piece right now. But it's very poignant that we get a chance to do a draft like this, because with roster construction, I would say for anybody that's just getting into the format, right? Like if you're just getting into best ball, you're getting, regardless of which platform you're doing it on. Because I know like Underdog with the best ball mania going on right now, everybody's interested in doing best ball. But if you're getting into it, I know it can become something that's daunting in a sense, because you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what player should I take and blah, blah, blah. I would say roster construction is probably the biggest thing or the biggest key to trying to win your league. Yes, I would say that is number one. I don't care if you're trying to think of like, well, do I get Patrick Mahomes? Do I draft Lamar Jackson? Who are the value guys? Who are the sleepers that I should be taking in the late rounds? None of that. Let's just talk about what your roster should look like, like how many draft slots you should allocate to each position, and try and fit within those guardrails, and then you should at least be able to put together some sort of optimal draft afterwards. And from FFPC standpoint, for the 28 rounds, so like the non-slim drafts, I mean, really to open up your draft, because within the first 6 rounds, like 6 to 8 rounds, so that's typically where like your opportunity cost is the highest. You're getting the players with like the highest expected value, like throughout the course of an entire season.
Yep.
I mean, that's really where the core of your roster is getting built at. And for the most part, at least from an optimal standpoint, like it really does come down to having a balanced type of rosters. I've seen for the most part, maybe like 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, and 1 tight end, or maybe 3 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and a tight end, something along those lines, like where you're not really overloading yourself one way or the other. And so, like if you wind up within the early part of the draft, capturing some of the value at each of those core positions, especially with FFPC because of the tight end premium scoring, that's really where you're setting yourself up and to be flexible, because like once you get into rounds like 6 through 9, that's where the quarterbacks start getting taken more often, especially with the non-slim rounds, like defenses and kickers start coming in around the round 15 area. I mean, so you really want to be able to plan for some of those runs where you're not really trying to reach on, let's say, running backs in the quote unquote like running back dead zone, like rounds like 5 through 7, 5 through 9, like so somewhere in there, or you're not trying to take like a quarterback like too terribly early and not having to be able to fall back on a wide receiver value late. So it's just one of those things where if you're abiding by some of just like the general guidelines for roster construction, that will typically lead you to like a higher ROI versus trying to figure out, do I go 0 RB, robust RB, modified 0 RB? Sorry, John Paulson, for bringing up modified 0 RB. But just all that other stuff, like the strategies that people talk about day in and day out, where it just really just comes down to sticking to that roster construction, trying to find those pockets of value with specific players throughout your draft.
Yeah, well, and there's a lot of different ways to get to that optimal roster construction, right? You don't have to, I mean, that's a finishing point. It doesn't tell you what positions you take in the first, second, third round. You can still piece that together as you go. And I think that's part of the fun of doing these drafts is you're testing out there. It's a really great like training ground or battleground for your season-long management leagues that you're going to draft in August, like your home leagues, being able to get these drafts under your belt in the best ball format is great because you don't have to think about them after the draft is over, really. But you are also getting, feedback from your own process in the draft relative to, what the market is doing. So you can try out different things. You can see what works. You can see what players are generally falling where, and you get to go a little bit deeper because it's best ball. You have to draft backups for every position. So we got the draft filled here. Looks like we're set to start in about 3 minutes. I'm going to pull up the draft board. Do you want to know what pick we got, Chris?
I've got it pulled up, and I see we've got an excellent pick, man.
The deuce.
We got the Bucko 2.
So the world is kind of our oyster here. I think the two players we can expect to maybe not be there are either Christian McCaffrey or Patrick Mahomes. The last time I had this position on the stream was 2 weeks ago. The first show with Sal. We took Travis Kelce 2 overall, and I liked how the roster turned out. I'm going to let you kind of dictate what we do through this draft because I want to get to know your process a little bit, how your brain works when it comes to Superflex. But with that said, let's not take Kelce second. Let's try something different. Does that sound good?
I think that sounds good. And 100%, I would agree that because of the Superflex format, I would say since we do have the 2 spot, either one of those 2 guys would stick out. I mean, if you were thinking about it from even just like a regular like Superflex draft, like if you happen to hop in like a Dino startup or something along those lines, I mean, those 2 players would probably be one of the early ones off the board anyway. So if you are trying to at least account for like the scoring format, or not the scoring format, but the positional format here with SF, I do agree that either of CMC or Patrick Mahomes would be one of the first guys like right off the rip.
Yeah, and we can talk about whether we want to take one of those guys. But before we do, let's quickly mention that if you get a subscription to 4for4.com, you are going to get a free voucher to do a draft here at the FFPC. So sign up for whatever plan works for you at 4for4. Get access to John Paulson's rankings and projections, Chris's articles, all the other great content on the site, and you'll get a free draft out of it. You don't have to use it on Superflex. If you prefer to try out the 1QB best ball format first, you can do that. It's up to you. And really, it's a nice value. It kind of pays back that subscription cost right away and lets you use what you can learn on the site to do a draft. It's a lot of fun. So now let's get into it, Chris. What do you want to do here at 102? I mean, we could A or B this too. We could say if they take McCaffrey, who do we want? If they take Mahomes, who do we want? What's your thought process for this top or second overall pick?
So yeah, like we were talking about earlier, I would say it's just one or the other, right? If we're either going to take, if they take Christian McCaffrey, we take Mahomes. If they take Mahomes, we take CMC, and we figure out from there. I would think though, like coming back into it at the back end of the second round, I mean, we do at least have to monitor what the quarterback situation is going to look like if we do forego the quarterback early, which I can kind of understand, especially if we wind up taking like CMC at the start. It's just trying to figure out, all right, well, we're going to wind up missing on that. I'm just guessing. I'm assuming like most of the top 12 quarterbacks are going to be gone like by the time it gets back to us. So it's figuring out like what type of value we can secure at the quarterback position afterwards.
So if you had the 101, what would you do? Because I think there's an argument to be made that if you were on the Christian McCaffrey plan 101, you shouldn't necessarily just default to Mahomes as the 102. You should consider whoever the second best running back is, right? Because if you think that McCaffrey should be first overall, then you believe that there's slightly more value to having the top running back versus the top quarterback. So then your decision is second best running back versus top quarterback. And I understand that, maybe the answer for you is Mahomes, but do you see what I'm saying? Like, should it really be that cut and dry as one or the other?
No, I agree. And actually, I like the way that you phrased that, because if you are looking at those two positions, like almost not necessarily equally, but if you are evaluating both those positions as your first pick, then you should have some flexibility to try and take a look at, well, who is going to be the second best running back that you would select here, which in this case would most likely be like Dalvin Cook, somewhere at least in that range. And then trying to, again, do that same sort of evaluation, like who do you want like over Patrick Mahomes, which you would assume to be in the quarterback one position. So I think that's where having tiers selected, or at least having tiers set up like prior to, would help you to evaluate, well, what is your, I guess, the opportunity cost associated with you taking that particular player. So if you can find somebody that's in the similar tier later, you can wind up selecting them like over the guy that you might have taken. So I think it makes sense to at least look at it from that perspective for sure.
So do you want to go Mahomes here at the 102?
I kind of do, and let's see how the roster shakes out after that.
I'm into it, particularly because, like, I hate it because I like to be that late round quarterback drafter, even in Superflex formats. But it's one of those things where every one of these streams I do and every slow draft I do of the Superflex format here at the FFPC, it's reinforcing this notion that I can't wait as long as I'm typically comfortable with on quarterbacks as I normally would.
Right.
And with that in mind, I do need to start dabbling in these other strategies to say, okay, what if I take an elite quarterback in the first round? How does that look? I think Mahomes second overall is worth it in a vacuum. So I'm fine with that pick. I think it gets a little dicier when you get to like pick 4 or 5 and you're choosing between maybe the third best quarterback and the third best running back. I don't know where my head is at. Like, my default setting is still to side with a running back or a wide receiver or a tight end, considering this is tight end premium scoring at the FFPC. Do you share that same lean in the first round? Or
100%.
Go ahead. Okay.
Because I typically approach the quarterback position in a 1 QB league in the same fashion, where it's like sometimes I do want to, let's say, try and take like the Kyler Murray's, the Dak Prescott's, the Lamar Jacksons of the world like fairly early. But at the same time, I'm that dude that's also taking like Baker Mayfield late, seeing what we can get for Daniel Jones like late, like taking some of those guys that can come later and just filling out the rest of my roster and building a powerhouse where I might have a volatile quarterback as the headpiece, but I've got so much depth already secured at the core positions. I really don't care at that point. So it is, I think it's important if you do a ton of these drafts to switch up your strategy, because it allows you to think about or evaluate the positions differently as you move through the draft. Because now that we've taken Patrick Mahomes at the second overall pick, what are we going to like? We can now look at, let's say a running back or a wide receiver, or a tight end, versus if we'd gone in the other direction, we might have to look at quarterback. We'd be forced to do that in the second round as the picks came back our way. So I think in doing so, I mean, it keeps your process flexible. And it also allows you to continue to evaluate the positions correctly. And that's why, going back to the whole tiers discussion from earlier, if you do it that way, it then allows you to look at each of those positions like across each position similarly, versus saying, oh, well, now that I've drafted this guy, I can't take this position later, or I can't do this later. I mean, it definitely allows you to have that flexibility as you go from draft to draft.
What does your top couple tiers of running back look like? Because I think it's easy to be like, oh yeah, I want McCaffrey. He's really great. He's going to get fed a ton. But after him, there's a lot of debate as to who should be the RB2, RB3, RB4, and then how deep is that top tier before there's a drop off and before you should start considering other positions, whether it's QB and Superflex or one of the elite receivers or elite tight ends. Like, what does the running back at the top look like to you? How are you parsing that draft to draft?
So for me, that top tier of running backs is actually about like 5 or 6 deep, because like all of the guys that we've been typically drafting in like the first like 6 or 7 picks over the past couple of seasons, they all have like a ton of red on their ledger, to be quite honest. I mean, Dalvin Cook hasn't finished the season. Let's see, Alvin Kamara, like we don't know what's going to happen with Drew Brees. Saquon Barkley coming off the torn like ACL and also the meniscus as well, if I'm not mistaken. Derrick Henry, we don't know what that's going to look like now that they've added Julio. I mean, Zeke, we don't know what that's going to look like. Him coming back like after COVID season, and with Dak also being coming back in that offense as well. I mean, all of those guys that I just listed off, I mean, everybody's taking them within the first like 5 or 6 picks, but we don't know how the season is going to go for either of them. You can talk yourself into any one of those 4 or 5 guys. So that's why I kind of keep them all squished within that tier, so that if I wind up missing out on one, I can wind up taking, I didn't even mention like Aaron Jones, like Cam Akers, and any of the rest of the guys that typically come after that. But it's just, if I keep them all squished within that tier, then it's easier for me to kind of like move in and out of that depending on where my draft slot is.
Yeah, and it's really easy to kind of get locked into a certain viewpoint on a position or on a tier of players based specifically on what happened last year. And I do worry that we're doing that to some extent with the top running backs, with the success of 0 RB types of drafts last year, and with the rushing or elite quarterbacks in particular, whereas we were really quick to push them back up the board this offseason. And I wonder if that's 100% legitimate. I think for some players it will be, but for others it won't. We've seen the quarterback position be very volatile year over year in the past, and I don't think that there's any strong reason to think that that's not going to be the case again in 2021, even if the elite producers last year were very, very consistent. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, because if you look at the quarterback scoring over the past couple of seasons, it's a tightly packed bunch. I mean, anybody can pull up like Fantasy Pros or like any other sort of like historical scoring site and just look at how close like the QB8 to the QB9 was, the QB9 to the QB10. I mean, they're all within just a few points of each other when it comes to looking at it from the season in totality. So it's entirely plausible that the quarterback 12 could be the quarterback 8, but that gap between them in terms of total points could be 10 points. Or something along those lines. So I do think that we should approach the quarterback with a little bit more scrutiny than we have in years past, just because we're pushing so many other, like all the mobile quarterbacks get pushed into that range. But any one of them, like Ryan Tannehill, where he's going right now, he could finish as a quarterback 8, being drafted as a quarterback 12. I mean, that's entirely within the range of outcomes. So I think that position out of any of them should be the one that we approach at least with a little bit more caution versus the certainty that we've had in the years past, because we've had just like definite like tiers or like archetypes of guys that we draft early versus guys we draft late. And now with all of that kind of coming together, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do that.
So we're coming up here again pretty soon, and we are going to do an FFPC coupon giveaway. That's happening. I will get to that after these next couple picks. I'll mention how that's going to work. We are one away here, and I'm not entirely sure what I would want to do in this spot. This is actually one of the reasons I don't like the first or second overall pick is this turn is very difficult to navigate. What do you want to do here at the 2.11?
So looking at the running backs that have gone, it looks like Cam Akers is still there. That kind of sticks out to me as like looking at some of the other guys that have been taken ahead of him. For the wide receivers, those all like the guys that I would typically want are gone right now. So I'm actually leaning towards Cam Akers at this point.
Okay, you like Cam Akers more than these other running back options who are available here?
So I'm saying like Joe Mixon, Aaron Jones, Antonio Gibson, Nick Chubb, DeAndre Swift, yeah, Kyler's there. Yeah, I think Akers is the one that sticks out the most to me like right now. I mean, what are you feeling?
I mean, I like it. I haven't drafted him a whole lot, so we're going to make him that pick here. And we got to think about what we're going to do real soon here at the 302. And then maybe we can talk a little bit more about why you like Cam Akers. But what's your thought process here coming back around? We have a quarterback and a running back. It seems like the draft board is largely running back and quarterback dominated so far. Only 4 wide receivers off the board. The tight ends you would expect to be gone are gone. What do you want to do in this spot?
So now just looking at like the value of some of the players that have fallen here, I mean, I would lean towards wide receiver right now. If Ridley's still on the board and judging by the wide receivers that have gone right now, I haven't seen him go yet.
Ridley's available. Jay Brown, Justin Jefferson. On the running back side, you got Chubb, Mixon, Aaron Jones. Basically all the guys who were looking at against Akers in the last round.
Gotcha. Ridley, he's in my tier, like my very top tier for wide receivers. He'd be the one that I pick. If he was gone, I would probably flip back to running back, but Ridley being there, it's too much to pass up for me.
Yep, I like the Ridley pick. Aaron Jones is very appealing, but I've drafted him a lot, so we're gonna stick with Ridley, and we're going for the Skittles approach here. One of each position. We're gonna try to taste the rainbow. I don't think we're gonna take a tight end next round necessarily. I mean, I'm not saying we wouldn't, but I would say if anything, chances are we might do it like on the wraparound in the 5th round, just because I doubt there will be that big of a drop off between us and the person on the wheel.
Yeah, and I'm kind of with you there. I know that a lot of folks, I don't know who else might be listening right now, but there are a couple of guys I might be interested in. But I am very much of the tight ends. Either you're still drafting them as early as possible, like the big 3. I mean, possibly big 4 if you want to throw like Pitts in there as well. But then the rest of the guys that are coming afterwards, sure, you can make a case for Goddard, Andrews, Hawkinson, like, some of those guys that kind of fall in that, I don't know, tight end, let's say like tier 2 range. But then all the rest of the guys after that, I mean, really, you can just kind of put them all in the hat, shake them up, and then pull one out, and then I'll just go ahead and wind up taking that guy. I mean, again, from an opportunity standpoint, from an offensive situation standpoint, I mean, none of them really stick out. Higbee, Fant, who was Logan Thomas. I mean, all of those guys that were really like rushing to pick up at this point don't really have a ton of upside, at least compared to the guys that were taking like 3-4 rounds earlier. And then also compared to the guys that you can get 3, 4, 5 rounds later. So I would much rather wait on tight end at this point. Let most of the folks take some of those guys that I just mentioned, and we'll see what happens afterwards.
Yeah, my take at this point would be, I do like that kind of sub tier you talked about earlier: Pitts, Hawkinson, Goddard. You maybe throw a couple other names in there, but I'm definitely not going to be the first person to pick from that tier. If I can get the last guy I perceive to be in that tier in a particular spot, I think that can make some sense. With that said, I don't know if that's going to happen in round 3 or round 4, round 4, round 5, our next 2 picks.
Right.
We'll see. Before we move on, let me talk about this giveaway. We are giving away a $35 coupon to use at the FFPC here on the stream. We're going to give away to somebody in the league. We appreciate people joining these drafts. It is difficult to fill them actually at times, as evidenced by the fact that this one was delayed start. But I'm going to have a little contest in, let's say, 2 more rounds. Let's say at the end of, after our next 2 picks, after picks 4 and 5, I'll announce what you will need to do to win the coupon. And I'm going to ask you to enter something into the FFPC League chat at that time. That way I can tell that, the person in the league is actually the person winning the coupon, as opposed to somebody in the chat who could be watching from anywhere. Like, could be an 8-year-old. I have no idea. But yeah, we'll get more to that after our next 2 picks. Talk about Cam Akers, because I see all the potential in the world there. I just also see Darrell Henderson in the picture. I see Matthew Stafford joining that team. I think maybe they throw more. Maybe that's good for Cam Akers in your eyes. Like, what do you like about him? And I guess, how many of the running backs who went ahead of him would you have taken Akers over? Because that seemed to factor into your decision, right? Was, Najee Harris, Saquon Barkley, Austin Eckler, Alvin Kamara were all gone. Do you have Akers ranked ahead of any of those guys? Is that why you felt the need to kind of jump on him where we did?
Yeah, I think that was more the value of the pick itself, and also the opportunity, at least in my mind, that I'm seeing for Akers in year 1, or at least year 1, like with Matthew Stafford as his quarterback. Because like with Najee Harris, I can see the path to him having all the rushing back, all the running touches, and also a ton of targets as well, like Le'Veon Bell-esque, like good Le'Veon Bell. But at least for Austin Eckler, my only concern with him is goal line carries. But if we think that Austin Eckler is actually going to get the goal line carries, then actually he should be taken like much higher. I've heard that argument from Rich Rebar a couple of times, and I 100% agree with that. We don't know if it's going to be the Justin Jackson and Joshua Kelly show once they get in there, or who's the other running back they just drafted? Was that Roundtree? I forget who the rookie running back that the Chargers drafted as well. Either way, Cam Akers, I think, falls into that that opportunity profile that we would want, right? Because we know that he can get a significant amount of touches. Also, the targets are also going to be there from, I think, 7 to 9% target share. The Rams, at least historically, they've been one of the teams that have rushed within the red zone, but that was with Jared Goff. With Matthew Stafford, I think that's more above league average than below league average. So even if that shifts up and they're passing more, it's still going to be a productive offense. So we would still want a running back on a team a running back on a good team. He checks that box. Productive team also checks that box. Going to get a number of the majority of the rushing carries, the rushing attempts, and also a part of the passing game. Checks both those boxes, and then he should get most of the work within the red zone, which we know they're going to get down to quite a bit, assuming that Matthew Stafford brings something good to the offense. He checks all the boxes that you would want out of a 1st or 2nd round running back. So for me, I guess above like Austin Eckler, because even though we know he's going to be in a good offense, we don't know if he's going to get the money touches. Same thing with Jonathan Taylor to a degree. It's just, I don't know what that workload is going to look like, if the target share is also going to be there for him. So it's just like where he fell to us in that draft. I would much rather take Cam Akers and then see what we got at wide receiver, which we got a wide receiver one in Calvin Ridley anyway.
That's right. Now I want to go back to tight end and talk about Kyle Pitts. There was an inkling in my mind after we took Calvin Ridley, maybe this is an Atlanta Falcons stacking team. And it's not a stack I think you should be afraid of, despite the loss of Julio Jones, because their defense is still going to be pretty bad. The targets are going to be very concentrated on Ridley and on Pitts and Russell Gage, I guess, question mark. But it's a relatively easy stack to get in some cases. But Pitts is going up and up these draft boards. If we like Calvin Ridley so much, I think it makes sense to push Kyle Pitts up. Do you push him up into third round as we've seen here? That seems a little rich, but I don't know. It might end up being worth it. Like, what do you think of Kyle Pitts, where he's going? And are you mad that he didn't perhaps make it back to us here in the 4th and 5th rounds?
Could we have taken him there? Probably. Yeah, I probably would have fired one at him, fired a dart at him at that point in the 4th round. I can understand why folks are picking him up, like, or at least drafting where they are for the reasons that you said. I mean, Atlanta's had they've been top 5 in neutral passing rate for the past couple of seasons. Similar passing rates, like when it comes to the red zone. I mean, regardless of what you think about Matt Ryan and his efficiency with or without Julio, we just know that the volume is going to be there, and that's what we want. I mean, if it's we don't care that it's going to be like, I mean, who else is going to be really competing for targets outside of, like we mentioned, Russell Gage, like Olamide Zaccheaus, I mean, Frank Darby, I mean, any of those other guys, I mean, don't really care about any of those guys. It's really just going to be like a healthy dose of Ridley, healthy dose of Kyle Pitts, and then we'll just figure it out afterwards. Like, even if Mike Davis gets into the mix, it's not going to take that much away from him. So at least from an opportunity standpoint, like, Pitts definitely falls into that range of tight ends that I know he's a rookie tight end, but at least from the situation that he's in, the offense that he's a part of, I don't see why you wouldn't wind up taking a swing on him at drafts, regardless of the price. I mean, especially in this format. I mean, why not? I mean, who are you really going to talk yourself into outside of some of those guys? I mean, we were talking about earlier. I mean, Hawkinson, worse offensive situation, at least we believe so at this point here in June.
Sure.
I mean, Goddard, we don't know how things are going to work out with Hurts, like getting a full season. I mean, there's just a ways that you can talk down or talk yourself out of those other tight ends, where with Pitts, it's just, I mean, I don't know, the sky's the limit, at least in my mind.
Yeah, and I like it. We may have talked Zach Kruger into taking the Pitts Ryan stack. I don't know if we started that. I don't know if we started the conversation before he made the Matt Ryan pick, but maybe he was listening and thought, hey, yeah, that is a good idea. I think I will do that. So maybe pencil him in for Russell Gage in a later round. I wouldn't be surprised to see him jump ADP to kind of keep that stack going, because he didn't get Ridley. That guy's on our team.
Yeah.
All right, we are up here, and I think we can go in any direction here based upon, what we've done so far. We have a very balanced roster to start. Top running back is J.K. Dobbins, according to FFPC. Wide receivers, lots of great options here. Keenan Allen, Allen Robinson, CeeDee Lamb at the top. Terry McLaurin, worth a mention. Looking at the other tight ends, it's Mark Andrews, and then I think there's a drop-off. I don't think that's necessarily a reason to jump on Andrews here. But what do you think? What do you want to do? We got 30 seconds.
So let's see if we can flip back to running back real quick and take a look at who's there. I mean, nothing really sticks out there. I would say flip back to quarterback. Let's just kind of see like where things kind of sit there. So yeah, I mean, if thin it out quick. I mean, so we've got Patrick Mahomes. I mean, what are your thoughts on taking any of the rookie quarterbacks at this point?
I'd be in for any of them. Fields is the highest ranked. I would actually take Lance over him because
I was just going to say that. So let's go ahead and knock that out.
Okay. That's a bit of a homer pick, but the Niners' schedule is really soft to open the year.
It's pretty soft to end the year as well, if I'm remembering correctly. I think it's like they played the Texans, the Titans, and I believe like one other. I had it pulled up just earlier, but I mean, it is a dream matchup the last few games.
What do you want to do on the wraparound here? I really like where we're at here. We have our two quarterbacks that we can consider starters. We do want to try to get a third quarterback at some point. I don't think we're going to double tap here. There's just too much value at the other positions.
No, absolutely. Depending on what happens here, what are your thoughts on selecting, and I'll see what happens afterwards. What are your thoughts on taking Mark Andrews here at tight end? Yeah, tight end 6.
Tight end 6. Is that right?
Yeah, I think
it is. Hawkinson ahead of him. Okay. I mean, there is value there, I think, at least by ADP, right? Andrews typically goes ahead of Hawkinson.
Right. So from positional ADP, I think that does kind of make some sense to take him there. And then we can kind of see like where the rest of, and then from there, we essentially have our core at that point. So I would go with Andrews. We figure out like what happens with the running back and wide receiver, but I think that's a solid core to start up the draft.
Okay. I'm into it. Like I said, this is your draft. I'm just along for the ride. And this is where your experience as an FFPC drafter is going to stand out a little bit above mine when it comes to the tight end specifically. Like the tight end premium scoring is something that I kind of begrudgingly deal with. I actually appreciate it. I think overall it makes the draft more interesting because it gives value to the elite players at literally every position. I do think that this format in particular punishes wide receiver. Like, the one thing I knew that I didn't necessarily want to do was jump to a wide receiver that I didn't like with that pick. Now, it just so happens there were guys on the board that I'd be fine taking there, but I think the lean toward tight end or toward running back felt correct to me. My instinct was to go with running back because, I just look at who's left available and you just start to get nervous. It's just like quarterbacks. Like, after a while, the known quantities at running back drop off pretty steeply. And I don't know, like, should we have taken J.K. Dobbins or Chris Carson there in that spot? Maybe. But, we do need to get a tight end. I like getting a potentially elite tight end in this format. So the Andrews pick also makes sense. But again, kind of my default calibration is to lean running back there.
Yes, and that's where if Andrews had gone where the guy out of the 101 or the person out of the 101 selected field, then I would have flipped back to either running back or wide receiver. So I think that's where, look at ZK saying, yeah. But I think that's where the positional value like portion comes into play. Almost similar to the Cam Akers picks earlier, is that if you see a player starting to fall, that you feel is more valuable than the other players that are currently being evaluated around him. And also we have the turn at least to kind of like leverage some of that, like where we're drafting at as well.
For sure.
That's where I think that became more of a value play, because you can see right now some of the like wide receivers like currently going right now. Totally fine with at least missing out on some of those guys just because of the fact that we got the elite tight end to go with it. I would have gone in the same direction that you were indicating earlier. Had Mark Andrews been selected, we could have gone with any like J.K. Dobbins. I think Miles Sanders is probably still sitting out there somewhere because I don't see his name out there. Any of the wide receivers, I think that would have made some sense. But given the tight end premium format, I think taking Mark Andrews here was the proper play. But I 100% agree with you. It's that with tight end premium scoring, I sometimes fall prey to that as well, because once you get into, let's say, the 5th, 6th, 7th round of drafts, I mean, that's where a lot of the quarterbacks are going. The wide receivers are just completely flying off the board, but tight ends, because of the 1.5 scoring, you're having to consider those as well. And that's where you'll see guys like I talked about earlier, that like the Higbees, the Fants, the Logan Thomases of the world, they get pushed into that same area, and you're having to consider each of those, like all 3 or 4 of those positions, like all at a single time. So it becomes very important in your first early picks that you wind up having, like we're talking earlier about having that balanced roster, so that you're not feeling like you need to reach, or you're feeling you need to fill out that position because you wound up either going, let's say, wide receiver early, so you feel like you need to get a running back later, or you went running back early, so you feel like you have to get a wide receiver now. I mean, doing it the way that I think we're doing it right now allows us for some flexibility throughout the draft without reaching on any one position later.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there is something to be said about starting with this balanced type of approach. And especially when you do lock in at least 2 starting quarterbacks, is then you kind of can just let the draft come to you. And where we took Mark Andrews as that onesie position, as that quote unquote high-end tight end, I think he was probably the last of the players you could really put that stamp on firmly. Mm-hmm. Now, because we're on the turn, or that we're near the turn, we can use that to our advantage to leverage double tapping a position to try to catch up at something. Like I mentioned how I felt that instinct to take running back there because there weren't as many known commodities. Now in future rounds or future turns, we can do 2 running backs in a row to say, okay, I acknowledge that I gave up some amount of certainty at the running back position. Now to make up for it, I'm just going to shotgun spread approach. I'm going to take 2 in a row that are relatively the same value. And that's how I'm going to approach the position. And you can do that with every position, right? You can do that wide receiver as well. If we keep waiting on our 2nd and 3rd tight ends, we could do it at tight end in the later rounds. Mm-hmm. So that leverage is something that I really appreciate with these picks that are near one or the other ends of the spectrum here.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say just to tack on to that. I mean, if you're factoring in, like you mentioned beforehand, that we get the turn in order to do that, you really can start to just eye the board and see who those players are that are falling, and seeing like what situations and what players we can really start to buy into. Almost like right now, like when I was seeing earlier, like Miles Sanders and Mike Davis, like those two running backs just went. Like seeing those guys fall, it's like, okay, so if everybody's still figuring out like wide receiver, tight end, all that, those two guys, like boom, boom, like those would be the running backs that you could just double tap and just be like, all right, I'm good. And we can sacrifice value at wide receiver and just completely wait until later, because we started off our draft strong. We started off our draft with strong players at each of the core positions, and we don't have to worry about trying to reach or whatever. We can just kind of let the board fall to us at this point.
So let's do the giveaway here. I want to give away a free draft to somebody here in the draft room with us. Appreciate you guys joining the league and getting the stream off the ground. And here's what you got to do. I am going to disqualify the other four people in this draft. So sorry, Sal. Sorry, Zach. You guys are not eligible for this contest. It has to be somebody else. And if anybody else from 444 is in here, apologies for excluding you from that comment, but you are also not eligible. What you will need to do is go down into the chat here in the FFPC draft room and tell me who the lowest ranked quarterback is on the FFPC here in the draft room. That's it. Whoever types it in first gets the giveaway. Any guesses as to who it is, Chris?
The lowest ranked quarterback?
Yep. It's mad disrespectful.
I'm going to wait and see.
Okay. Nobody's chatted yet that I can see.
I can see. I saw. Oh, okay. I thought, yeah, Heineke. Seen that one come in.
Is the chat not working for me?
Oh, PJ Walker. Ooh, I like that one.
PJ Walker is correct. Who put that in?
Jeff Dumont.
Oh, you put it in the wrong place, Jeff. You're supposed to do it in the chat on the league page.
Oh.
There's still time. Get in there. Thankfully, these are timestamps. We can figure it out later. Chris, we are on deck. What do you want to do here?
So let's see. Let's look at the board. I mean, a lot of the running backs that I was interested in selecting here to kind of get us back on track are gone. If we wanted to do that again, flipping back over to a wide receiver, the guy, let's see. So a couple of guys stick out to me. Tyler Lockett definitely sticks out here. Thielen still also sticks out. I think any of those guys, like let's see, Deontay Johnson, Adam Thielen, Tyler Lockett, I think those all stick out to me right here.
Okay,
Tyler Lockett for sure.
You're thinking wide receiver is the way you want to go here. I agree that there is a bit of a drop off at running back at this point. So Lockett is your top guy at this stage.
Yeah, he'd be my. I think the way you have him listed there is about how I'd do it.
Okay. Lockett, welcome to the team. And we did get multiple people quickly chime in the chat. Jeff, I apologize that my instructions were not clear enough. You blew it because Cubby Strickland beat you out. PJ Walker was the lowest ranked quarterback on the FFPC. And I'll pull it up just to make sure everybody doesn't think I was cheating here. Philip Walker, like below Devlin Hodges, that's just rude.
Yeah.
I don't like it. I'm a PJ Walker fan. I know Sal is too.
I know I definitely slept on PJ because I'm a Teddy truther. So I was really hoping that Teddy would be able to make it a bit longer in Carolina than he did. But I mean, I'm thinking that there's a non-zero chance that he winds up playing even this year too.
For sure, and that's why I think it's ridiculous that he's their lowest ranked quarterback. I mean,
Sal agrees.
MVP. Yep, Sal gets it.
Sal always gets in.
We're coming back here. The top of the FFPC rankings are all QBs. We got Tua, Daniel Jones, Roethlisberger, Zach Wilson, Sam Darnold. I don't know if we want to take our third QB this early, but I don't know. What do you feel about it? Do you want to go back to one of these other wide receivers you like? Do you want to look again at running back? I mean, we might as well take a look at tight ends too.
Yeah, so we can take a look at it.
Like, I don't think it's tight end time.
Not
the running
really
backs are inspiring, although we still only have one on a roster, so I could see, taking the plunge on somebody we like. But what do you want to do?
I'm still leaning wide receiver at this point. I'm still seeing a ton of value like right here. I mean, again, still any one of those guys that are right there. Adam, yeah, Thielen, Deontay Johnson. I mean, I have to show some love to my Cincinnati Bengals. I mean, T. Higgins like being out there is also like pretty decent. Yeah, I could go with any one of those, any three of those wide receivers and be completely happy.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that Thielen was kind of top of your queue last round, and he's still there for us. What do you say about taking him in the spot?
Absolutely fine with that.
Okay. Yep. Should be a target hog, assuming health. What is your approach to that with players who are aging or maybe just have a little bit more tread off the tires like Thielen? Do you try to factor in injury risk to how you evaluate them, or do you kind of assume that everybody's probably going to stay healthy because anybody could go down in any instant? What's your approach to injuries when you're doing these best ball drafts?
It's kind of twofold. If you do think that any of the receivers that just players in general, that you think they are fairly, let's say, medium to high risk in terms of injury, like with Thielen, like definitely that possibility. I mean, Tyler Lockett, I mean, he's also been like banged up like a couple of seasons in a row, still been able to finish everything out, but still, you can insulate yourself just by the number of players that you select at that position. With wide receiver, it's easy. I mean, you wind up selecting more wide receivers than most any other positions anyway. So at least at this point, looking at how we've structured our wide receivers, we're taking Thielen as our third wide receiver. I think at this point, we've mitigated most of that risk. Now
it feels busted. Yeah, it feels really good to have Adam Thielen be your wide receiver 3.
Exactly. But now, obviously, if you put on the microscope to the wide receivers we've taken, then Calvin Ridley, didn't he just also have like a cleanup procedure done on his foot? Tyler Lockett, he's been, like I just mentioned, like he's been banged up. I mean, a couple of seasons right now in a row. So, I mean, obviously there's injury risk or like that abounds like throughout the wide receiver position. But for Adam Thielen carrying the most risk out of the three, taking him as our wide receiver 3, I think is the best way to look at it.
Makes sense. Earlier, Sal asked us to say some nice things about his team. So
his team's the best. What are we talking about here?
I mean, what do you think of his draft so far? We do a lot of nitpicking when we look at some of these other squads on the stream. It's kind of just part of the process, right? It's like we compare their draft to ours, what we have done in their spot. And I got to be honest, looking at what Sal's doing, I do like it. He's stacked with Fitzpatrick, with McLaurin already. Devontae DK is a pretty spicy wide receiver combo to go with Travis Kelce as a first rounder. Gaskins appears to have the gig to himself there in Miami. I'm not fully convinced of that, but all indications so far. And Zach Wilson's going to have to throw at the very least. So the volume should be there. This is a nice start, don't you think?
Yeah, I have no issues with it. Like to start off with, I mean, that would almost be how you would want to kind of harness like the leverage or like the power of like the pick that he had. Like when he starts off with Travis Kelce, I mean, I know a lot of folks, like if you take Kelce like in the first round, you're almost thinking, all right, well, I got to flip back to running back, or I need to look at a running back like the very next pick. It's like, no, like you've essentially taken a wide receiver as your very first pick. Lean into that. I mean, and that's exactly what Sal did, like by taking like Devontae Adams and DK Metcalf like right off the bat, and then taking a value quarterback as where he did. So I mean, right now, so where is it? Fitzpatrick went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like quick math in public, that looks like he's like Ryan Fitzpatrick went as QB 15 somewhere in there. So I mean, if you're able to wind up also getting at least a decent quarterback, stacking him, and also grabbing his wide receiver 1 on top of that, I think that's like a really great, like really solid way to start a draft.
I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about your process when you're in one of these draft rooms. It's a little different when you're doing a slow draft on FFPC. You have time to really contemplate all of your potential decisions, right? Like you can spend time looking not just at, the top of the board at any position, but, you can look a little deeper, try to assess which positions you want to plan on taking later. Here in a fast draft where you only have 45 seconds per pick, or 60 seconds per pick, like you have to really think on your feet. You have to use the tools available to you. And just within the draft room, like you have access to a queue, you have access to the list of players. It shows you your roster. You can pull up the draft board as we've done here in another tab. Like, what is your approach just to generally navigating one of these drafts? I think that sometimes we talk a lot about process, but we don't talk about like the nuts and bolts process. And I'm curious, what your factory settings are when it comes to going through one of these drafts.
I try and devoid myself of any at all like strategy talk when I hop into these. like any of the like thinking about zero RB, modified, robust, like none of that stuff. Like I try and just focus on the players as they come to me, like during those early parts of the draft, because that's really what sets up the strategy for like the almost essentially like the rest of your draft. And especially since now stacking has become a larger part of folks' process, you can start to figure out or at least anticipate what your drafters are going to be doing just based off of the quarterbacks that they draft, similar to what we saw ZK wind up taking, like, Kyle Pitts and Matt Ryan. And then, well, I mean, he took Julio Jones later, but obviously it's not a stack. But I mean, but you can start to like look at your opponents and watch their drafts and start to, I guess, surmise like how their draft is going to go. And then that can help you kind of formulate your strategy moving over. Because I almost look at doing fast drafts like playing poker, because you're not just planning out your roster. I mean, you're getting information from the other rosters that you're currently watching being drafted as well. So you can take those little bits and pieces of information and then start to tailor what your strategy is going to be as the picks start to come in. And so while it might be a little bit more like, I don't know, it's almost like playing a real-time strategy game. Like, I don't know if you ever like played one of those as a kid or whatever.
Oh,
like
yeah, StarCraft, Warcraft.
Command and Conquer, StarCraft, like any of that stuff, where you're having to think on your feet. That's exactly what you're having to do here, where you really do, like, as long as you have, like we were talking earlier about just like the basic guidelines of like roster construction and all that, but then you marry that with the information that you're getting like in real time from the other drafters in the room. And that's how you can at least try and like kind of keep to an optimal strategy as the draft proceeds.
So one of the things I did there kind of while we were talking was I just put the top ranked quarterbacks in the queue, and I started filtering through the other positions, right? Looking at the available running backs, looking at the available wide receivers. And that way it lets you kind of compare one to the other. And I do think in a Superflex or 2QB format, the quarterbacks are kind of the backbone, the spine of the draft, right? Sometimes they'll be taken earlier, sometimes they'll be taken later, but you really need to pay attention to the pace at which they're picked. And we are getting to the point now where people are taking their third and fourth quarterbacks to try to leverage that position. So it's thinning out. We're looking at a lot of guys who could potentially only play part of the season. So putting those guys in the queue to kind of compare to what you're looking at the other positions, I think, is valuable. We're on deck here, and I don't know if we want to take a third quarterback in this spot because the person at the turn also has 3 QBs. It's very unlikely that they'll take 4 here. I think the best way to leverage this pick is to take another running back because our number one drafter also only has 1. With that said, like, running back is kind of a minefield right here. And the wide receivers that we could take as an alternative, like, there are a lot of really solid names here. What do you want to do?
I was actually leaning in that direction. So if we wanted to try and maybe look at taking a running back here, I mean, Melvin Gordon kind of sticks out. Mostert, if you want to stack him with Trey Lance, if you took him earlier, or even Trey Sermon to reach, it might be somewhat of a reach. But any one of those running backs kind of stick out to me right here. Okay.
Well, who do you want? It's like I said, it's your draft.
Let's go ahead and let's go with Melvin Gordon. I still think he starts off the season. It might be, I don't know how many games he's going to wind up getting out of him, but I do think he at least has a solid role like entering the season.
Right. And even if he does cede work to Javonte Williams, I could very well see, just out of respect, Melvin Gordon still remaining the goal line back, which in best ball sometimes is just good enough, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We're coming up again here. Do you want to go back to the running back well again? Do you want to maybe consider our tight end 2, wide receiver? Is this where we want to take our QB3? Like, Cam Newton is already off the board, so maybe Mac Jones, if you want to bet on that timeshare. Like, I'm not incentivized to take any of these guys, really, to be honest.
No, neither am I. But I do think like Mac Jones probably has like the best upside, like out of any of them. So I do think if we're gonna take him, yeah, I wouldn't mind taking him at this point.
Okay, and there is some safety there, right? Typically, when teams draft rookie quarterbacks in the first round, those guys are playing sooner rather than later. I don't know if that's going to be the case with Mac Jones. But again, all these other options are pretty ugly.
Yeah.
I don't think Deshaun Watson is playing this year, so he's just off my board. And so then you're looking at all these other guys who are potentially in timeshares. I don't know. Do you want to go with Jones or do you want to do something else?
I'm fine with Mac Jones.
Okay. So there's our third quarterback. I feel like we can still consider maybe drafting a fourth one later, but it won't be a high priority. We can really lock in on the other positions at this point going forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, going back to the decisions that we made earlier, drafting Patrick Mahomes like off the rip allows us to wind up taking, I mean, essentially two rookies. I mean, what other quarterback would you really ever feel
Yeah,
comfortable
sure.
doing this sort of strategy with? I mean,
Lamar
it really,
Jackson for me. He's
that's
at
what,
the top.
yeah.
He's
I was like,
on
but
the
it has
list.
to be, but it has to be one of like the top guys at the quarterback position that we
Mhm.
know are going to be in like not the top 12, but I mean the QB1 conversation week in and week out. And that would be like one of those guys. Like either it's like Patrick Mahomes, Lamar, maybe Kyler, because of the rushing production. I think Josh Allen kind of falls like just slightly out of that. But any one of those guys, I mean, would be the only players that I really feel comfortable in waiting this long to get our quarterback 3.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a very short list. And for me, the order is Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray. I think those are your three deepest floors,
Mm-hmm.
or best floors, I should say, most reliable floors. I don't know exactly how I want to word it, but those are the guys I trust the most to consistently put up points, kind of regardless of game script. In Lamar Jackson's case, it's because of the rushing floor. In Kyler Murray's case, you get that rushing floor, and you also just get potentially like a high play volume in that offense. Mahomes is obviously just amazing. Like any given drive can be a touchdown drive from anywhere, and that, even though that's like a ceiling argument, the fact that he has that ceiling also gives him like kind of a silly good floor too. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Josh Allen, I agree, is just a slight step low for me. And I don't agree with him being the number 2 quarterback off the board. I understand why people are drafting him there. Like that offense has really improved. He has really improved.
Sure.
But we can't just ignore those early season struggles on his ledger. You know what I mean? Like those turnover tendencies could rear their ugly heads yet again. It's possible. We can't rule that out. And so I am of the mind that Allen is a very slight rung below those other three.
No, and I 100% agree with you. I mean, we just did this, like we're doing this right now with Lamar Jackson. I mean, after he had like the stellar like 2019 campaign, I mean, 9% touchdown rate, he falls back to a 6.9% touchdown rate, which is still well above league average. And all of the like, there's almost like hit pieces out on Lamar Jackson as to like,
Sure.
he's not a good quarterback anymore. And we don't even care about the wide receivers that he added. I mean, any of that, I mean, all of the stuff that we heard has not been as positive as we were about Lamar Jackson when we were ending the 2019 season. Same deal with Josh Allen. Like, why can we not even speak about the possible regression for Josh Allen here in 2021? And that's not to
Don't
say he's
talk
going to
about
be
it.
bad. That's not to say he's going to be bad. But if we're drafting him at the quarterback 2, I mean, we have to at least accept the fact that him being the quarterback 5 at the end of the season is within the range of outcomes, and we're just really not talking about that. Whereas I'd be much happier drafting Lamar at his cost, because at least I can see the path to him getting back to where he was at in 2019.
So getting back to process, I'm going to do the same thing I did last time with quarterbacks, except I'm going to do the tight ends because that's the next kind of onesie position we need to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to put basically the tight ends as they're ranked in the queue. And that way, when we pull up running back or wide receiver, we get a direct comparison to where we're at the tight end position as well. I think this sort of stuff can be useful. This isn't necessarily the way I would always do it. I think there's probably more value in actually setting a queue to, the order you would draft players across all positions. But here on the live stream, I don't want to do that. I don't want to give away too much information to the other people who are drafting with us and watching this, right? So
Yeah.
I'd rather instead use this as a tool to kind of help me navigate the positions relative to one another. We still got a full round coming back to us, but I think it's getting to the point in the draft where we have some tougher decisions to make every round. Running back is going to be very thin. Wide receiver is still going to be pretty deep, but we're not talking about elite producers at this point necessarily. You could still have some guys elevate. Tight end, we are going to need to draft backups. This is tight end premium, so it's possible that if one of these tight ends does break out and they're, our number 2 behind Mark Andrews, that we might only need 2 if we get the right guy. If we don't feel confident in that, then we might have to draft 3 of them altogether. This comes back to that roster construction idea you talked about at the top of the show. So I don't know, where does your mind go in these middle rounds when you have all these different inputs and all these different possibilities?
At least for me, that's when I go back and look at like where am I currently sitting at in terms of roster allocation. So looking at our current setup right now, I mean the 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, and a single tight end. My first instinct would be to go and look at, all right, well, what does the tight end landscape look like right now? What does the running back landscape look like right now? Just to get a feel for what's the positional value like as of right now. Because if we're set on wide receiver and we also have the turn to leverage as well, then we can at least take a look at the positions that are quote unquote of need right now,
Sure.
and then evaluate who's there, and then see if the value also matches up with the fact that we should try and pick up another running back or tight end.
So Sal has asked us to rank the remaining quarterbacks. And normally I wouldn't want to do this again because we're streaming. But with that said, I feel pretty confident that we have our 3. There's not a whole lot of need for us to draft another one unless we feel like we get an insane value. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that by ranking them now, we're helping out the other drafters in the room all that much because it is such a crapshoot, right? It's really going to come down to games played. Like, is Garoppolo going to hold off Trey Lance? Is Bridgewater going to beat out Drew Lock? Is Tyrod Taylor going to hold that job? Can Andy Dalton hold off Justin Fields? Like, I almost always lean towards the rookies in this situation, as evidenced by the fact that I was willing to pick Trey Lance and Mac Jones where we did. But what are you doing with the QBs in this range? Because in Superflex, this group of players matters. Whereas, like, honestly, in a 1 quarterback format, you don't even have to think about these players at all.
No, exactly. And at this point, I'd say the best equivalent I can think of for quarterbacks in this range is almost how we would look at those late round wide receivers and running backs, where, I mean, tell yourself a story as to how any of them can wind up at least in the top 12 discussion and like kind of outkicking their ADP, like from a value standpoint. And looking at who's there, I mean, Drew Lock definitely has that in his range of outcomes. I mean, in terms of being like a top 12 quarterback on a week-to-week basis. I mean, Taysom Hill also has that with the rushing upside as well, and also having guys like Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas to throw to. So at least those 2 guys like stick out like almost immediately. I'm with you regarding Deshaun Watson. I don't think he plays not a single game in 2021. I've completely removed him from my board at this point, so I'm not even on my radar. But then after that, the rest of the guys, like you mentioned, Jimmy Garoppolo, Tyrod Taylor, Andy Dalton. It just really comes down to how many games we're actually going to get out of them. I mean, and even still, the discussion of how do we see them getting into the top 12 discussion on a weekly basis, that becomes much harder than the guys I listed beforehand.
Yeah. So for me, the first question I ask myself is, who do I think is going to win the quarterback battle? And it might not be who's going to start week 1. It's who's going to start more games for that team this year. So like with the Denver guys, I've talked about on the stream before, I think Bridgewater is going to end up playing more than Drew Lock. I believe in Bridgewater as like a safe option more than Lock as a guy who might figure it out and hit a ceiling. Like, if Drew Lock was going to done that, if he was going to do that, he would have done it by now. Yeah. So, choosing between those 2, I think Bridgewater would be near the top of the list. I do think Hill belongs in the conversation for the top guy here, because even if you don't get a starting quarterback, he's still going to have some weeks where he scores touchdowns and gives you some usability as a player. The problem is that he can only slot into either your quarterback spot or your Superflex spot. So if he's scoring 8 points because he caught a touchdown pass and that's it, that probably means you had a pretty bad week in terms of quarterback play otherwise. And so, so it's like, it's good, but it's also not good. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think after that, then you really are just throwing darts. Like, so then you could gamble on Garoppolo, you could gamble on either Tyrod Taylor or Davis Mills. Again, I lean Mills because I think they're going to want to see what they have in him. They did take him with their first pick in the draft, albeit a 3rd rounder. But anyway, that's enough on the QBs. Let's talk about what we're doing with our next picks. We're on the clock. We can see what tight ends are available. Irv Smith, Evan Ingram, Jonnu Smith, the top of the FFPC rankings, not necessarily our rankings. Running back is a cluster. I am not excited by any of these guys, but I mean, there are some decent options. Wide receiver, a little bit more appealing. Like, you can, again, tell yourself that story that, Marquise Brown is going to hit a bunch of splash plays. Jarvis Landry is going to be that PPR machine. What do you want to do with this pick?
Like you, I was looking more at the running back position, seeing like what's going to be available. Ronald Jones, Zach Moss, James Conner, like those 3 names, and Jamal Williams, actually those 4 names like stick out the most to me at this point. Almost kind of looking at Yeah, I think those guys would any one of those four I think would be probably the best. I'm lean most towards Zach Moss at
Okay.
this point in the draft. I think that would now just making sure.
I picked him, so you're too late.
Okay.
We got Zach Moss on the squad.
Oh no! I was just checking for bye weeks just to make sure he also didn't fall on week 11 like the other two guys that we currently have. So yeah, as long as we offset that, then we're okay.
We got Zach Moss coming in with this week 7 bye week. Now, does that mean you're confident Zach Moss is going to beat out Singletary for the running back 1 gig there in Buffalo?
Yeah, for the most part, and I think that's essentially what they've started indicating, at least in terms of like snap rates, like towards the back end of the season. Now, it is kind of interesting though that Singletary did have the higher target share, so I do see him as a late round value. But from a money touch standpoint, like a high value touch standpoint, I think Zach Moss has the edge over Singletary in that area of the field.
Makes sense. So what do you want to do with this next pick? We go back to running back. I mean, this is somewhere where we could take one of those other guys you mentioned. I think my preference would be either Ronald Jones or Jamal Williams. I'm not a James Conner guy. Wide receiver, again, a lot of decent options here, but I kind of look at that and think, okay, that's a good reason to pass on it. Or we could get our tight end too in this spot. What do you think?
So I am leaning towards Ronald Jones, or I do like Ronald Jones actually here in this spot. Jamal Williams does stick out a bit more to me though. I'm still trying to figure out like how he doesn't wind up seeing at least a significant number of both targets and touches and high value touches as well, because we saw him being used similarly when he was in Green Bay. So I actually do kind of lean towards like Jamal Williams here in this spot. Also provides us with a bit more flexibility at the running back position since he does have that week 9 bye. So I think I'd lean Jamal Williams here.
Okay, let's do it. Yeah, this is kind of an interesting spot where at least Jamal Williams, you can look at the way he was used in the past and think, okay, he's probably their goal line back. The tea leaves are telling us that they don't want to use DeAndre Swift in that role. But Williams is also capable of catching passes. He's not bad in that regard. So you could see him kind of steal even more work from DeAndre Swift. And the reports coming out of Lions camp are that that's kind of the way they plan to use him, which, again, if you're a Swift fan like I am, it's not great, but it does seem to open up a lot of value in this stage of the draft for Williams.
Right. I mean, over the past like couple of seasons, like between Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams, while Aaron Jones has been the more successful running back, like in terms of like rushing success rate, over Football Outsiders, I think Aaron Jones was like 5th in success rate. Jamal Williams was 6th. I mean, Jamal Williams also was able to take over. I think he had like 3/4 of like, or at least to like 75% of the rushing attempts, at least as compared to Aaron Jones, those high value touches that we want. Also was rocking like an 8 to 9% target share before he exited Green Bay. I mean, there's so much the potential there for Jamal Williams to get similar opportunity in Detroit. We just know that the situation is going to be less. That's assuming that Aaron Rodgers is still going to be in Green Bay, but still, I mean, I don't care like which squad he's a part of. Jamal Williams should still continue to see a decent number of touches wherever he winds up with. And he's such a cool player to root for. I mean, I know we take like fantasy, like when we look at fantasy and projecting opportunity and all that, we always get down to all of like the nitty gritty, like EPA per play and all this other stuff. But Jamal Williams is just a cool guy to root for. So it's just, I don't know. I might be a truther, especially with all like the jokes and like the way he does his interviews, dance on the field and all that. So I'm down with Jamal Williams for sure.
Hey man, this is supposed to be fun, right? Fantasy football is a game. We're supposed to enjoy it. And if we enjoy it more by drafting the guys that we like, that's fine. Like I'm definitely here for that. Can you contrast our pick of Williams with a pick of Tony Pollard 2 spots later? Because I think there is an argument in some roster constructions for Pollard to be the pick ahead of Williams. I think the way that we drafted this particular team with only one running back early in Cam Akers, we were incentivized more to kind of chase the floor of touches with Williams. But
yes,
the Lions offense, man, it's a little scary. Like you talked about how he's going to get high value touches, but are the Lions going to have a functional enough offense to give us enough of those high value touches? I don't know. Whereas you could look at Dallas and say, okay, that's going to be a high powered offense, a high octane and up tempo offense yet again, assuming health for Dak in this case. And if all that comes together, if Zeke continues to wear down a little bit, maybe Tony Pollard usurps him, or at least Tony Pollard carves out a larger role based upon his own talent. I think Pollard is the upside play. Jamal Williams is the floor play. That's my read on it. but I don't know. There might be some people who see Pollard as having a higher floor than I do. What do you think?
No, I'm with you there. I think in contrasting or at least evaluating either of those two running backs, that's really where you do have to take your prior selections like into account. Like where, I mean, Sal taking Tony Pollard as our RB3, I can get behind like Myles Gaskin and Damian Harris, like both guys that we know, at least for the most part, I mean, going to be primary rushers of their offense, both
Top
involved
dogs.
in the passing games. I mean, like no issues there regarding their workload. So you can swing for the fences with a Tony Pollard pick. Whereas for our squad, we do have to try and pick our spots and we need to accumulate more floor. And so that's where that conversation, like you mentioned earlier, about like trying to evaluate upside, because you made the case yourself, and we don't know like what type of role Tony Pollard's going to have coming out here. By all reports, I mean, Zeke is back to where he was at, like
looking great, right? Yeah,
looking great. I mean, best shape of his life season is in full effect.
I
mean, so we don't know how much like Tony Pollard is going to be a part of that offense. Whereas with Jamal Williams, we know like we've already. I mean, everybody's already gone and like researched or dug into what the quote from Anthony Lynn about the A-back, B-back thing. Like we know Jamal Williams is going to have a role. So when you take a back like Tony Pollard, you really do have to take your running back group into account before you make a selection like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like if we had taken Aaron Jones instead of Calvin Ridley, and maybe started the team that way, then maybe Tony Pollard would have made more sense for us at 11:02.
100%, right? Yes.
So that's where the roster construction, like we took a running back either way in this kind of A or B scenario, but the type of running back you take matters as well. And you kind of have to do that calculus as you run through these best ball drafts, in addition to, just figuring out, what position to take. It's like, well, which guy at the position, what type of scoring profile do I want? Do I want that floor? Do I want that ceiling? How am I attacking this?
Yeah. So that we can look at guys like Gus Edwards that was taken a bit earlier. I mean, most of those guys that, again, have projectable floors. And that's kind of where you would want to try and understand, like, well, what's the ceiling for Gus Edwards? It might not be as high as a guy like Tony Pollard, but at the same time, if you're looking for floor, Gus would be the guy that you would want. Same thing like we were talking about Zach Moss with the Devin Singletary, and also playing with a mobile quarterback in Josh Allen. Might not have the ceiling, but at least the floor is there. So that's where, again, trying to understand not just the player, their situation, but also the archetype of player that you're drafting within the context of your team. That makes that takes it to a whole other level that really it dives into the nitty gritty that just roster construction alone won't provide.
Let's try to dig into this next pick with a little bit more advanced notice. Again, like I'm kind of to the point now where if somebody else in the stream wants to snipe us, that's fine. That forces us to think on our feet. So we can talk about, who we're looking at in the 12th round. Because we are at this stage where we don't really know who's going to be great, who's going to be serviceable, who's going to be really bad. There's upside and downside to all these players in this range. That's why they're not early round picks, right? So a few picks left before we come up here. Wide receiver, still some solid options, guys who are going to be probably number twos or kind of maybe 2Bs on their respective teams. Running back is still a bit of a wasteland, but Ronald Jones is staring at us. We mentioned him earlier, so I am going to put him in the queue, move him up. Again, if somebody snipes us, that's fine. His running mate, Leonard Fournette, is the next ranked running back by the FFPC. And then you can see the top of the tight end ranks over here as well. Ferkser, Everett, Jarwin, Gronk, and Jared Cook. I don't know. What's your thought process as the draft comes at us?
So I think after the Julio Jones news, like Ferkser has admittedly he's fallen like quite a bit, and that kind of makes sense. But at the I'm seeing like tight end 16, 17 that we essentially be drafting him at. That's not bad value. I don't hate that at all. He would be a guy that I'd be targeting and just making sure that the bye weeks offset. So yeah, the bye weeks do offset. So we're not drafting like two with the same bye week. He would be a guy that I would be targeting here. Everett, I also don't mind, just given how often Russell Wilson has been targeting tight ends like over the past couple of seasons, but it's just been like a conglomerate of dudes. Like if it hasn't been like Hollister or like old Jimmy Graham or whatever. But yeah, I think Ferkser is the one that sticks out to me is in order so we get our tight end 2, and then we'll kind of see like what happens after that.
My lean here is wide receiver. Like I'm looking
Okay.
at some of these names. And again, if you want to go tight end, we can do that. But let me make the case. Do we really care if we get Ferkser or Gerald Everett? Like, does it matter like which one of those two we get? Like to me, it doesn't. Like those guys are close enough in value. Whereas I don't know, like Jarvis Landry, I feel like just shouldn't be here still. Like considering it's a full PPR format, considering he's like the clear, number 2 or at least 1B to Odell Beckham Jr. in Cleveland. I think if we look at overall, he's right behind Ferkser. I don't know. Same bye week. What do you think? Did I convince you?
Oh yeah, you convinced me, especially because I saw like Pittman and like Darnell Mooney like going ahead of like that were just drafted by the guy at the 3 spot, and I was just like, oh okay, so I didn't even think he'd be there. But yes, absolutely. If you're staring at him in like a guy like him this late in the draft, absolutely you take him.
I just again like, and maybe I'm falling prey to the floor thing. Like this is something where this might be like a season long or like league management problem where I look at it, Landry, and I think safety, I think reliability. But in best ball, you do have to play for more ceiling, right? And maybe I'm not doing that with that pick. But look, here we are with our choice of Ferkser or Everett if we want it. Just pulling up the other tight ends here. Jarwin, Gronk, Jared Cook, Ertz, Hooper, the rest. So if we want to take a tight end, we can do that now. Are you still on that plan? Do you want to go back to running back or wide receiver? What do you think?
I think I'm fine with taking Ferkser at this point as our tight end 2, and then we can kind of navigate and see what the tight end landscape looks like on our way back. I think he'd be the pick for me here.
Okay, Ferkser is on the squad. At least I clicked the button. We'll see if it takes. I feel like I have one moment every time I do these drafts where I have to refresh the draft room, and this appears to be it.
All right. Yeah, it came through. I just saw it come through.
It came through, but my browser at least is still frozen on it. It's showing me new picks, but it hasn't shown a move on. Like Mahomes just got drafted. So we'll do a little refresh, and we'll take this little moment to once again remind you that if you sign up for a 4for4 subscription, 4for4.com, you will receive a voucher to use here at the FFPC to do a draft of your own. You can jump in one of these Superflex streams with me. We'll be doing these on Tuesdays and Wednesdays every week. For the most part, it's going to be Tuesdays going forward. That's a little programming note for everybody. But I think I've got one more Wednesday stream at least, I think in 2 weeks. But the rest will be Tuesdays. Or you can just go draft on your own. You can do a slow draft. You can do a 1 quarterback draft. It's up to you. Once you get that sub, the world is your oyster here at the FFPC. Let me make sure the draft room understands that we are here and available to make picks. So pull up the draft board. But yeah, head over to 4for4.com, click that red subscribe button up in the top right corner of the page. Pick out the plan that works for you, and you get to do a free draft to the FFPC. What could be better than that?
Nothing.
What's been like your favorite draft so far? Like I know you're out in those best ball streets, Chris. Like, are there any that stand out to you as like being like early season standouts?
Nothing off the top of my head. I mean, but at this point in the season, and I don't know if you look at it the same way, but I'm trying at least at this point to find some of my blinders, just if it's not players that I'm out on, teams that I'm out on, so that by the time we get into like the real like fervor state of like drafting, like end of July, like early August, when like everybody's coming back and it's like football season, blah, blah, blah. Like that's when I really have a better understanding of where I'm at, like as a drafter, like finding those gaps in ADP, players that I'm in, or like I'm taking stances on players, teams, so on and so forth. And like that's really what I've been doing over the past like week or so. I've done maybe close to like 50 drafts like over on Underdog, and I know at least the 2 things that I know of right now is that I'm much more I guess skeptical, at least from a draft perspective. I'm skeptical on both the Colts and the Giants, and I am really heavy into both like the Seahawks and the Eagles. And the Colts thing is the one, as the Colts situation is one that I'm really trying to like get my handle on, because like we just saw the guy out of the 3 spot draft. I mean, he took Carson Wentz, he took Michael Pittman, and also T.Y. Hilton. Now, are those the pieces? I mean, a like relatively cheap stack considering he got Carson Wentz at what the QB, let's say like 16, 17, and then like, Pittman and Hilton like in the 11th and 13th round. So it's just, is that going to be a functional offense? Like, can Frank Wright bring Carson Wentz essentially like back to fantasy relevance? after we saw him completely crater last season. Like just one of those questions where like if you make the proper stance, you could wind up really profiting over the fact that, I mean, you do have a functional offense, a good offense. Whereas, any folks that are still having some sort of trepidation regarding Carson Wentz, just using recency bias, they could be just kind of left outside, kind of watching everybody else take the value of what could be essentially a potentially really good offense.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for me with the Colts is that Carson Wentz just looked broken last year. And like that, again, that's recency bias for sure. But we also see sometimes when these quarterbacks go off the cliff, like I'm not saying it's an age cliff in this case. This might just be an ability cliff, a talent cliff, a mentality cliff. I don't know what it was with Carson Wentz last year. Maybe it just had to do with injury. And if he's healthy, it'll be fine. But like that sort of stuff makes me nervous. Players coming back from injury make me nervous. Like I look at the Cowboys and how we're projecting them to be this prolific offense again, assuming Dak Prescott is going to be healthy. But that injury he had looked really bad. And I don't know if I can swallow the pill of his draft costs where he's going. Like I've already talked about how he doesn't even scratch that top 3 or top 4 for me. I'll probably rank him as my QB5 or QB6 because, again, if he is healthy, he's worth that. But I don't know. Like that sort of stuff is where I find my blinders, is where those weird biases come in, like not based on anything tangible, not a number, not a stat, but on like a gut feeling or on some narrative from the previous season or from the previous few seasons that is kind of stacking up against a player in my mind. So that's the stuff that I have to work through. And I have to say, okay, like what is the actual projection for this player? Like, why am I so much lower than the projection or higher than the projection? And is it justified? And these drafts are a really good way to kind of calibrate that, to see where other people are willing to draft them and have that light bulb go on and go like, wow, like if Sal took this player like 3 rounds before I was willing to, maybe I need to reevaluate. Or if Zach Kruger does, or whoever, like it doesn't have to be someone like these drafts are relatively sharp at this point in the season. Like the only people drafting right now are true degenerates. When you see people make those sorts of decisions, like a lot of times it is roster construction or team construction. Like, that player who drafted all those Colts clearly just ended up with 1 or 2 and said, okay, I'm going to stack Colts. Whereas like you look at our draft, we're talking about all these players that we like in these spots, but we haven't stacked at all. Like, is that a problem for you at this point? Is that something that you think, we need to correct, or that, we've already come too far? We might as well just like steer into the skid and keep not stacking, or just worry about it kind of as it falls together. Like, what is your take on that?
No, I don't necessarily think that it's something that you have to do. Like, is the benefits to correlating your teams? Absolutely. I mean, the math has been, I mean, that there have been like tons of articles like on that over the past like couple of years. But what I do find that some mistakes that are made by drafters are that you think that has to happen, or that you have to stack. And in that case, you wind up either reaching on players and making like suboptimal decisions. Now, looking back over our roster, like could we have taken, let's say, like Trey Sermon other than Mac Jones and wound up pairing him with Trey Lance? I saw Deebo Samuel going earlier. I mean, so something like that, or Patrick Mahomes and Mecole Hardman just went.
Hardman just went. We could have taken him over Landry, over Firkser.
Yeah, exactly.
Like maybe that was our screw up. I honestly think, like, just a super hindsight bias, but yeah, I think maybe we should have taken him there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where you do have to make those decisions, or those conscious decisions of like, do you think that making that reach is worth the value that it projects? And especially this late in the draft, I mean, ADP, like reaching at this point in the draft isn't all that much of that big of a deal, just because opportunity cost is minimal. But I do think that that's one of those, like, you just look back on it and you start to evaluate your process. It's like, as you're going through these drafts, it's like, okay, I drafted Patrick Mahomes, so I need to be on the lookout for Mecole Hardman, like, and the rest of those other guys. Trey Lance, be on the lookout for Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, and all the rest of those guys. All right, so what are we doing here?
45 seconds. I pulled up some wide receivers in the queue. I'm looking at running backs on the left. And I don't know, does anybody stand out to you?
I mean, the guys you got at the top of your list, like Parker stands out. Parker, Marvin Jones, and Gabriel Davis. All 3 of those guys like stick out to me. Not really seeing anybody else.
Stacking with Nelson Aguilar. We just talked about this. Do we reach on Aguilar? This is a case where I think that would just be a reach, right?
Yeah, that would be wind up being a reach. I would take Parker over any of them. Parker or Jones, like for me.
I'm gonna be the tiebreaker and say Marvin Jones because I wanted to talk about Marvin Jones specifically with you because is he just one of the most undervalued wide receivers right now where he's going relative to not necessarily what his projection would be in that offense because there are a lot of other receivers who are going to get targets for Jacksonville, but based on track record and what he's capable of, what we've seen him do before, like he's going to get theoretically a fine QB in Trevor Lawrence. They should be throwing a fair amount. Their defense isn't going to be very good. What's not to like about Marvin Jones at this price?
Nothing to be quite honest. I mean, there's nothing not to like. I mean, he was undervalued when he was a part of my Bengals, like however many years back. Undervalued once he moved over to Detroit. I mean, even working alongside Kenny Golladay, when Kenny Golladay went down, I mean, Marvin Jones still thrived with an increased target share. So now we're going to pair him with Trevor Lawrence, who we know is like a fairly decent deep ball thrower. I mean, yeah, and we know that they're going to be put behind in a number of situations because their defense is still rebuilding. Yeah, Marvin Jones for sure.
So it's back on us here. Gabriel Davis is the top wide receiver currently. At this point, I think you can make the case for stacking with Nelson Aguilar and Mac Jones. Tight end, we could take a tight end 3. I'm not in love with any of the names. And then, of course, there's running back. And maybe I'll pull up quarterbacks just to see. Yep, confirmed. I don't want any of them. What do you want to do here in this spot, Chris?
No, give me Mac Jones, wide receiver 1, or at least the one that we assume is going to be his wide receiver 1, and Nelson Aguilar.
Nelson Aguilar. Is that the way you think that's going to play out? Because the reports right now are that Jacoby Myers is looking good, but I mean, can you really put anything into those types of reports at this stage of the offseason?
No, at least not for the wide receiver position. It's harder for me to do that because we're not really seeing any like sort of details in terms of how they be. It's different. It'd be different if with the Elijah Moore like stories that have started coming out with like Robert Saleh saying that they've used Elijah Moore at like X, F, Z. I mean, like multiple positions. We're not seeing the same thing about Jacoby Myers. We're just seeing that he's doing good, and that's good. Don't get me wrong, but I would want to hear more about his development as a route runner. I would want to hear more about him being able to separate versus like man or press coverage, because those were things that was kind of lacking like last season. That's why he would blow up for a couple of games and just completely disappear like towards the back end of the season. Like there were just pockets of games where he might get the volume, but he couldn't produce. And that could be because of Cam. We don't know, but it's hard for me to sell myself on a guy like Myers completely outplaying or completely overtaking Aguilar, given the money that was provided to the deal that Aguilar got. And then also, I mean, Aguilar has actually turned into, or we watched him evolve into a better wide receiver at this point. Yeah, so at least from a skill set perspective, I'd say that Aguilar already beats Jacoby Myers hands down before either one of them step on a field. So I don't even care about the offseason reports unless I get that stuff like we got about Elijah Moore from Saleh.
Yeah, for me, like a lot of that stuff is going to be relative to expectations, right? Like a coach is going to say, this player's looking really good. And I mean, is that compared to like what they were last year? Is that compared to like low expectations, high expectations? We don't know. They're just saying what they're going to say. And we're not going to get that context we need to really evaluate a quote like that. So I agree with you. Let's get back to that idea of roster construction at this point, because we're getting down to the final rounds. And do we have enough running backs? Do we have enough wide receivers? Do we want to draft a third tight end or a fourth quarterback? Looking at our squad so far, what's your evaluation?
Right now, I think we similar to what you were just saying a bit ago, are kind of weak at the running back position. I wouldn't mind tacking on at least like 1 to 2 more, because this is what is 18 rounds.
18 rounds is correct. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So at least left. Yeah. So with our last like 3 picks, at least 1 to 2 of those go to running back. A third tight end, absolutely. And then, if we wind up getting at least a decent, or wind up looking at the running back position and saying that we're solid, then I can go for 1 more wide receiver. But at least running back would be at my highest priority at this point.
Yeah, I'm going to load up the queue with all of the running backs here. And that's not to say we would draft any of these guys, but again, just kind of to help us compare one position to another. I agree that at this point. Don't say his name. We don't want to give it away just yet. But I agree. There are a couple names here that I like a lot more than others. Wide receiver, there are still a lot of viable players, like Sterling Shepard being available here. You talked about how you're kind of fading the Giants offense, and I'm right there with you. they brought in too many new pieces for me to feel comfortable with any of them, unless you want to make the argument that like Daniel Jones is just going to get elevated a little bit, or that, more passing options makes things a little bit easier for Saquon. But, Barkley was already a first rounder. Daniel Jones is who Daniel Jones is. Like, I don't think that the pieces they brought in really change his outlook too much. And just to the fact that I don't really think Daniel Jones is that good in the first place. But with that said, Shepard available at this stage in the draft seems pretty good to me, more so than a lot of these other names. But Denzel Mims, Emmanuel Sanders, Christian Kirk, I've talked about on the stream, is kind of a weak spot for me. Like, I'm just still kind of a fan. I'm not an AJ Green believer is really what it comes down to. I mean, I'm sorry. Again, I know the Bengals fan in you is saddened to hear that, but I mean, we saw it happen to Andre Johnson. I'm not saying AJ Green's there. Maybe, going to a better offense will, light a fire under him. I don't know, but I'm not going to be the person in a draft who takes that chance. Anyway, and not that Kirk has shown anything better than AJ Green over the past 2 years either. So it's like, who am I to talk about one guy versus the other? But that's just kind of the way I look at it. But again, yeah, wide receivers are fine. Tight ends, it's pretty ugly. I agree. We need to kind of focus on running back to kind of catch up at that position, because it's one that we ignored early. We kind of addressed in the middle, and then we started ignoring again. So yeah, we got some decisions to make. I know you said one of the running back names stands out to you. We'll see who that is if they're still there when it comes to us. If that person comes off the board, you can just say it. But
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know who you're thinking of. This is going to be fun to find out.
Oh, he just went.
Ramondre?
Yep, that was the guy that was sticking out to me there. That was the one that was I was just thinking about him too.
Sorry to hear that.
That was that's a kicker right there.
Yeah, for me, the guy I was most interested in there was Darrington Evans. Just pure handcuff type pick. But if Derrick Henry does finally break down, somebody else is going to have to tote the rock there in Tennessee, and that offense is going to be better. But I still think they're going to want to run the ball a fair amount, and maybe it's Darrington Evans. I don't know. We're on deck. Here's our top running backs. Here are our top wide receivers. Let me know if you want to see tight ends or quarterbacks instead. What do you want to do?
So looking at those running backs, so let's see. Tariq Cohen was the one that I was thinking about. He just went. Can I sell you on Kenny Gainwell?
Sure. You talked about how you're into the Eagles.
Yeah, I mean, into the Eagles. I mean, I really do feel bad, like, for Boston Scott. I mean, because I'm like just put on like my UDFA's forever like hat and just like hoping that those guys can. I mean, but still, I mean, with the draft capital that they wound up spending on Kenny Gainwell, I mean, that gives us at least a clear signal as to how they want to use him. I could see him having a decent workload like right out the gate. So yeah, Gainwell at this point, I like him.
Okay, well, I made him the pick. We have one more coming here. This is our second to last pick. So pulling up the roster, again, we have 5 running backs, 6 wide receivers, 2 tight ends, 3 quarterbacks. Might as well audit the QB position one more time real quick. Deshaun Watson's still available. And some people will make that argument that, like, he shouldn't be off my board this late in the draft. And maybe that's correct. But if I truly believe that he's not going to play, I don't think you can take him here. I really don't. Like, it's not worth burning the roster spot if your feeling is that strong on a guy. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. Like, if your stance is that he plays even a few games, or he gets traded, or like if you see a path to him playing, then sure, you draft him. But if your stance, and I agree with your stance, that he doesn't play a single down like in 2021, then no, he's not worth the roster spot to me at all.
Okay. Do any of these other, I mean, Drew Lock, maybe. Again, we kind of made the case for him earlier. Maybe that's a value play you can take here. I don't think we need to, but it could be some slight insurance if the Mac Jones pick doesn't pan out. Maybe Drew Lock will. We looked at the running backs. They're, again, kind of ugly. And then wide receiver, there are a few names I like here. I mentioned some of them earlier, but I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, looking at the wide receivers, I mean, tight end, I mean, if we wind up just drafting a guy like at the back end, that's fine. I'm looking at wide receivers. Yeah, Paris Campbell sticks out to me. Paris Campbell, Sterling Shepard. I mean, Gabe Davis, we talked about him earlier. Any one of those 3 guys, I think, stick out as the final wide receiver for us here.
You like Gabriel Davis more than Emmanuel Sanders?
I kind of do. I mean, yeah, if I if I'm thinking about it, I do like Gabe Davis a bit more than Emmanuel Sanders.
We're going to take Paris Campbell, but yeah, that's interesting to me because my first instinct is to go with the more proven player in Manny Sanders. But wide receiver changing teams, we know Josh Allen has, again, had problems with accuracy in the past that didn't really necessarily manifest in 2020, but maybe that hurts. But that hurts all of his receivers, right? If that does come back. So, but again, if you couple that with a wide receiver coming into the mix and having to learn the playbook, having to learn to play with the quarterback, maybe that is a reason to rank Gabe Davis ahead of Manny Sanders. But again, like Manny Sanders has been so usable for so long. Is it just a youth thing? Like, what is it about Davis that stands out to you?
It's part of that. It's the youth thing, but I think Manny Sanders also has the fact that he would primarily play like within the slot, so that would also give him some of those high percentage targets and routes that would wind up like netting him at least a decent number of targets on a week in, week out basis. But also like Gabe Davis, like he wound up like second in red zone targets like towards the back end of the season. Like when we really started to come on, we saw his snaps and touches start to elevate within that offense. So if we can, if they continue to build on that in his second season, I could see him being a value. Whereas like Manny Sanders, how much, I don't know. What's the difference between Manny Sanders and Cole Beasley, at least from a value perspective, other than the fact that, Manny Sanders is going 3 rounds later than Cole Beasley at this point.
Yeah.
I just don't know from a high value touch standpoint if Manny Sanders is going to have more than Gabe Davis, but I could be wrong. I'm completely open to being wrong.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what Sanders' average depth of target is going to be in this offense, because I think that's the argument for him over someone like Beasley. I think Beasley is that underneath guy in a PPR format like this, or like a best ball 10, or just a normal PPR league that you manage during the season. Like maybe Beasley is the safer pick because we've seen him in this offense. We've seen him be highly productive in this offense. But if you're looking for somebody who might come up with more splash plays, and maybe that's what you need in a particular best ball construction, like I could talk myself into Manny Sanders, fitting that bill. Even though Diggs is also there kind of soaking up a lot of those targets. But yeah, it's an interesting discussion. Like, how do you value the pass catchers after Diggs in that offense? So we haven't even mentioned Dawson Knox. Like, what's he going to do?
Right, so, exactly.
Yeah.
And actually, we could wind up taking him as our last tight end, like with our last pick, to be quite honest.
We could. And so that's kind of the question we have to face here is, do we take another running back or do we take a tight end? I don't think we need another wide receiver. Ridley, Lockett, Thielen is a great opening 3. I think this value on Landry was insane.
That's honest. Ridiculous. Yeah, I love that.
It's like your wide receiver 4, Jarvis Landry, in the 12th round. Like, sign me up for that in literally every single one of these drafts. I'll take that if I can get it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, if that's our top 4, if we only need to start 2 wide receivers in any given week because one of the wide receiver spots becomes a super flex spot,
right?
Or one of the flex spots becomes a super flex spot. Like, I don't think there's value for us in taking a wide receiver. It maybe if there was someone that we wanted to stack, you could make that argument, I think. But from a roster construction standpoint, I think there's more value in us going back to running back, back to tight end, or even back to quarterback, to be honest. Like, if Drew Lock was still there for us at the end of the draft, like, sure, maybe we could do that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What do you think?
I think I'm with you there on that process, because wide receiver strong out the gate. The amount of draft capital that we spent early on helps you figure out you don't really need to continue to take wide receiver.
Roadmap.
Yeah, it gives you the roadmap. The same thing with running back. We've got Cam Akers early. We got a lot of those floor backs in like Gordon Moss Williams like later. We tack on a high upside pick, so that would essentially be like so. Kenneth Gainwell could be our Tony Pollard light, in the sense that like if something were to happen to Miles Sanders, considering that's happened beforehand, Boston Scott continues to just play his like minimal role, Gainwell could wind up being the guy that winds up being like their RB1. So we have our upside pick along with having at least a number of usable weeks along the way, throughout his rookie season. So really, I do go back to looking at the tight end position at this point, just because, Mark Andrews is great. We can see him ascending back into like the overall, like at least, big 3, or at least right outside the big 3 conversation. Ferkser, if we do have some concern like with his weekly usage, I wouldn't mind like going back and looking at the tight end position. So we just saw like Dawson Knox that he just got picked.
I mean, look at who's available. It is not good. Like I look at these names and I second guess it. I'm like, I don't want a tight end anymore. Now I want to take a running back, a quarterback, or wide receiver. But do you like one of these guys? Because like I don't want anything to do with these players. Like I think Mac is Mo Alley Cox is maybe top of the board, or maybe Jacob Harris if you want to tell yourself that story. But I mean, you're really grasping at straws in this group. Like the running backs, like at least you could get a handcuff type with Mac or P. Ryan. McKinnon's kind of interesting in Kansas City. The wide receivers, I mean, again, we don't need one, but like Sterling Shepard is still available somehow. Denzel Mims is still available. Like, why? I don't. I mean, I guess I understand like wide receivers devalued in this format,
but like,
yeah,
I just don't understand. Sorry. Like, I just don't understand like why guys like Pringle. I guess I can kind of understand, but like, talk to me about like KJ Hamler, like Tim Patrick, like those. I would have to think on like maybe reevaluate my own process because like Emmanuel Sanders going right there. Like I would take Emmanuel Sanders over like most of those wide receivers, but that's where doing stuff like this like helps you reevaluate like where you're at like with valuing some of these players. From a tight end perspective, yeah, like Mo Alley Cox sticks out because he's like the only name, but also going back to that,
enormous. You can't miss that guy.
Yeah, and it goes back to that bias that we had about the Colts to begin with. Like, what form of Carson Wentz are we going to get? So I could see a case for taking him right there. I
don't think it's the pick. Like I think you with this roster construction, we hope that Mark Andrews is elite. We hope that Ferkser fills in okay behind him, and we take another running back here, or I mean,
and that's
quarterback.
Yeah, and that's
Drew Lock still there. Actually, is kind of appealing to me, and like Drew Lock should be drafted in a Superflex format. Don't you agree?
No, 100% agree. I thought he was drafted earlier. Yeah,
you want to take him here?
Sold.
Okay. That's fair.
Like that adds much more to our roster than what I think Mo Alley Cox would have been able to provide.
And that's it for me too. Is like even if Locke only starts 6 games, like you might only get 4 to 6 usable weeks from Mo Alley Cox anyway, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas Locke could be a full season starter, like most of the season starter, and we don't know how soon Mac Jones is going to get in there. I think there's appeal to that. Like it's very similar to making that like extra tight end pick is making a 4th quarterback pick.
Yeah.
And again, to me, it comes back down to the idea that he just should be drafted. Whereas I don't think Mo Alley Cox should be drafted in every draft, and I'm not an 18 rounder. You know what I mean? No.
I mean, and that's where thinking through like the tight end premium scoring, like you'd think like every tight end is viable. It doesn't really that's not necessarily true. Mm-hmm. Just given like the types of like how many tight ends that you've drafted, which type that you have. And I think we're fairly insulated with the tight ends that we've gotten. I think the only other player I could think of, and actually I saw that Justin Jackson pick, it made me think of it, Joshua Kelly. He could have been the other player that I would think about, since we were talking earlier about Austin Eckler and if he also has those high value touches. If we're doubting that in any way, shape, or form, then either Justin Jackson or Joshua Kelly should definitely be on our radars.
Wow, Joshua Kelly's really buried down here, down at 291 in the overall rankings here at FFPC.
Yeah.
And there's Larry Roundtree. We were talking about him earlier. Confirmed the Chargers running back. But let's look back at the draft, and this is kind of the stage where we can take questions from the people who are still watching the stream. There's a few of you still on here. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them out, and we'll try to answer them real quick. But from the perspective of our draft, quick hindsight review, are there any picks that we made where you look at the other picks on the board and you think, shoot, I think we screwed that up? Like one that kind of stands out to me, and I don't think this was the wrong pick, but where we took Ferkser, we could have taken Garoppolo to kind of handcuff the Lance pick and make sure that we have all of the starting weeks of the Niners QB. Because we talked about making this Lance pick because with like the Niners schedule. Mm-hmm. But if Lance only starts, half of those games, then will this really have been worth it? Probably not. If we take Garoppolo here in the 13th, or maybe I can't justify taking him over Jarvis Landry. That was just too sweet.
Yeah.
But I think like Garoppolo versus Ferkser is kind of interesting. But I mean, looking at the tight end that would have come back to us, I think Ferkser was still the correct pick. I think we just have to bank on Lance being the predominant starter in San Francisco. But are there any other picks of ours that stand out to you as maybe ones that we missed on? and like you see another player who like, we should have taken this player in this spot. It would have helped our construction.
I think that's one that does kind of stick out. I'm also kind of replaying so those two picks in succession. So Trey Lance and then Keenan Allen that went right after that. Yeah. I'm almost thinking if we had gone Keenan Allen and then try and because I would have been fine with either Trey Lance or Justin Fields at that point.
Sure. Yep.
And then that would essentially like the ripple effect over that would have been enormous because we would have completely switched focus in round 6. Probably would have gone with a running back.
Not a wide receiver at that point, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's the one where taking a look at the value at either of those positions, I think that might have changed our focus throughout the rest of the draft. So then, like the Melvin Gordon, Zach Moss, Jamal Williams, that would have been completely changed at that point. Whereas, I mean, I think that's the one I might have flipped around, but I think everything else, given where we were at, and just kind of talking through most of it, I think we're pretty solid.
Yeah, I think the only other one that I like to me is a little like a sliding doors moment is this Calvin Ridley pick. Like, if that was another running back, what does that do to our roster? Because then maybe one of these running back picks becomes another wide receiver pick. Like, you take this Melvin Gordon spot and you turn that into Brandon Ayuk to go with Trey Lance, or you turn it into, Odell Beckham, any of these other wide receivers like Cortland Sutton, like a lot of these guys who are potentially wide receiver ones on their team. So you're still getting a guy who's going to be the top target getter on their squad. Maybe it's not at a Ridley level, but if you kind of substitute that value you lose on wide receiver with the value you gain at running back, is that worth it? I don't know. I like the Ridley pick. I don't think I would go back and change that one necessarily. But I do think that this Trey Lance one in particular is like you said, like if we don't take Lance there, if we take Keenan Allen, maybe we don't even take Mark Andrews here. Like maybe this person takes Mark Andrews because he doesn't like Trey Lance.
Right.
And so there's, like you said, there's this cascade of effect that would trickle down the whole board.
Yeah, I think that's the pivot point right there for me in that decision that we made there at the 4th round. And I think that speaks to kind of how things shake out in like almost independent of scoring format or the roster format, because even in 1QB leagues, I mean, those early round picks, that really is what kind of sets up the rest of your draft. Because once we made the decision to go early tight end, it's like, okay, well, we don't care about any of the rest of the tight ends for like the next 6-7 rounds. And that's where, I mean, looking at Ferkser later on when we did, it's like that's pretty much the only reason. It's like, okay, we need a tight end too. So for all the rest of that stuff, the decisions we made afterwards, like it's the early rounds that really set up like the rest of your draft, and the decisions that you make right then are really how you can wind up figuring out, well, what's your strategy going to look like while still adhering to at least the optimal roster constructions as we discussed early on.
All right, Zach wants us to win on his team. He is out here in the 11th spot. He started Dak, Kamara, Kyle Pitts, Matt Ryan, and then 3 straight wide receivers. I mean, that opening looks good to me. What do you think?
I think that's solid. I mean, it's similar to how we were kind of building our squad. I mean, if you swap out, Calvin Ridley for Kyle Pitts, I mean, you're almost still looking at essentially adding in a wide receiver at that point. So I like the way that he started off with the picks that he got at wide receiver afterwards. So yeah, Amari, Evans, Jones, I mean, solid. Judy, solid. And then you got the value wide receivers there. I'm really digging Traquan Smith at this point in drafts this season.
Same. That's a nice pick.
That's a solid pick as well. So, and then he ended up with like Byron Pringle, another it could wind up having some of the spike weeks that you would want like out of a wide receiver taking that late. So yeah, solid draft like through and through, man, for Zach for sure.
I like this tight end pairing too. Pitts with Irv Smith is just like a lot of upside here with Pitts, and presumably a lot of floor with Irv Smith. What do you think about this really straightforward structure over here from the 12 spot, where 2 QBs, 4 running backs, 4 wide receivers, then kind of alternating some tight ends in there for value and finishing off with some dart throws? Like, this is a very straightforward approach to the draft. But what I like about it is that it looks at the 2 most scarce positions and it says, I'm just going to hammer those. I'm going to get 2 locked in starting QBs. I'm going to get as many running backs as I can who have locked in potential workhorse roles. And I think this drafter did that with Mixon, Gibson, Montgomery, Miles Sanders. And you know that wide receiver is deep, so you're going to get some nice players in these middle rounds, and certainly did that with Galladay, Ayuk, Beckham, Robbie Anderson, Antonio Brown, Elijah Moore, Gabe Davis in the last round. Like, he waited a long time, or he or she waited a long time to get these wide receivers, but that's a nice wide receiver group, isn't it?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think if like structurally speaking, if I would have gone that route, I probably would have aimed to take more wide receivers just because the amount of time that they waited in order to grab a wide receiver. I mean, I would want to try and get as many darts at that position as possible.
Yeah,
but
one
just
of these running backs could probably be a wide receiver. You're right.
Yeah, but but the names he wound up hitting on, I have no problems with it. I mean, yeah, I do have. I mean, we were talking earlier about just like my blinders, like for the Giants offense as a whole. But still, I mean, Ayuk, love it. Odell, Robbie Anderson, I think is a huge value, at least in relationship to where DJ Moore is going. Because look at where, I mean, DJ Moore was taken in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th round. And then you get Robbie Anderson there. I mean, was that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rounds later? I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, when they're essentially like wide receiver, like 1A, 1B, like type situation in Carolina. So yeah, love all the receivers that they're able to do. So I think this is a very strong draft as well, especially for leveraging the turn like that too.
Any other structures that you find interesting or that you like, or that you would have questions about, like any of these other approaches to kind of the way the positions were drafted stand out to you?
So I think Team 5 stands out to me, like from a construction standpoint, like starting off with the quarterbacks early, running backs early, and then kind of taking like to me, it looks like they would just try to go like value. I'd see like, getting value,
player available type approach.
Yeah, like that type of approach. I don't know if I would have taken like the 4 tight ends there. I guess I can understand if you have some concern with like any like, Hooper, OJ Howard. I mean, like any of those guys, I guess I can understand that. But yeah, I would like to like dig into more of like, having that sort of construction and like doing something like that. Don't mind it.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit of trash about DeAndre Swift relative to our Jamal Williams pick, right? If we're picking Jamal Williams, that means that we have some fear of DeAndre Swift. But when you get Swift in the 4th round, and then you can back up the risk associated with that pick with some floor plays like Fournette and David Johnson in the later rounds, like I think that grouping of running backs makes sense to me.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I was thinking about, like when I saw it, because I was almost like in my mind, I'm like, and also compare that with the wide receivers also selected. I mean, you got some pretty solid wide receivers too. I mean, we wanted like Deebo Samuel, like Cortland Sutton, we think is coming back strong this year. I mean, CeeDee Lamb as well. I mean, we see his ascension as a wide receiver. I mean, and then some dart throws later with like Rager, Bateman, and all that. I mean, yeah. From a construction standpoint, I really like how that squad turned out. And then, of course, yeah, they were the ones that got Sterling Shepard like at the very end of the draft. So I think that's solid too.
So Jeff is chiming in. He was here at the 9 spot. He says no one's beaten his team. He's got the Zeke Saquon start, which, maybe 2 years ago you talk yourself into that being completely insane. But this year I think there are more question marks, right? But then Tannehill and Burrow after that, again, attacking those scarce positions early. This is kind of a theme, I think, with most of the drafters. And then 3 straight receivers who are ostensibly the number ones on their team in terms of target volume. Allen Robinson, Robert Woods, Deontay Johnson. I guess maybe we see Kupp get more targets than Woods, but I'm a Woods guy. But Boyd, again, a bit of a target hog. Chark, I don't know what to do with the Jags offense. I'd rather wait and draft Marvin Jones, which is what we did here.
Yep.
But Bridgewater, Davis Mills, Deshaun kind of stacked up as a Houston pairing. I don't know. This is a pretty reasonable squad as well. Really weighted on tight end, and I don't think got punished too much for it, right? Jonnu, Gronk, Blake Jarwin, Dawson Knox. Like there's 4 tight ends there. That's more than I would like to draft generally. But when you wait that long to draft them, that's the way to do it, right? You spread out more volume to account for the risk that you're taking on with those picks.
Right. And each of them have, I mean, like these solid paths to, if not like targets, but also like the high value touches. I mean, Gronk, like we already know like what he can do within the red zone. Jarwin, we saw his upside before he went down. Knox, we've seen him pop up for a couple of weeks here and there. So yeah, I think those those tight ends that you wound up drafting while they were late, I mean, those are the types of guys that you would want, that any one of them can wind up popping off for a week where there's at least like you can squint and see a floor like for most of them. My only question, I saw somebody bring this up in the chat. I mean, if they were going to, since they went Tannehill, Burrow, and then Bridgewater like early, I don't know about the Davis Mills, Deshaun Watson. I might have been fine with just 3 and maybe turn those into like wide receivers or something like that afterwards. But other than that, I mean, I think this is pretty solid as well.
Yeah, this QB approach makes me think more of a season-long management league where you take the stab on Mills and Watson because you know that by week 1 you'll have a clear picture of which one of those guys you can drop.
Right.
Something like this. I mean, drafting them together in a best ball means that, yeah, you're kind of upping your chances that you are going to get the Houston quarterback. But spending that many picks on QB when you're also spending 4 picks on tight end does limit your upside at wide receiver, or not. Maybe it's upside and floor. Like it just kind of limits you at the other positions because you don't have the volume that some of the other teams do. And, you know, if the players you picked at those positions at running back and wide receiver work out, then maybe it doesn't matter. But my approach is generally for more balance, more focus on the positions where you have to start more players like running back and wide receiver.
Yeah, I think that's where I would want at least 1 to 2 more darts at the wide receiver position. I mean, all solid names, but I mean, literally any one of them get hurt, any of them miss a game. I mean, any of the valleys that might likely happen, like throughout their, you know, between the peaks and valleys of their production. I mean, any of that, and your team starts to fall behind. Whereas, I mean, other teams that draft like, you know, 6, 7, 8 wide receivers, you really don't have to worry about that. Where, you know, especially in a PPR format, that's probably going to be at least one of the workhorses of your entire squad. So I'd want at least a couple more chances at that position.
Any other final thoughts here on the draft board before we get to the sign off here, Chris?
I mean, no, like overall, I mean, sharp room, like overall, I think a couple of picks, at least 2 or 3 picks that come to mind where I know you and I were kind of like thinking about a couple of players and they wind up getting taken earlier, or overall, I thought there was like a fun draft to do. I mean, my very first like Superflex draft. So, I mean, fun to walk through the process. And I think from an overall standpoint, I mean, this is definitely a format that I'm going to have to start doing a bit more in the future.
Yeah, it's fun. I think the thing that I'm having the hardest time calibrating to is the quarterback pacing.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing I'll say is the more and more I do these, both the slow drafts and the fast drafts, you do have to pay up for quarterback more than you would in other leagues. And I know that other people might say, well, this is how it's always been in my 2 QB formats. But for me, I think I've been a little spoiled. Like I play with enough other people who like to fade quarterbacks, I guess, that you see more of that going on. But in best ball, where you don't have the waiver wire to pick up, you know, the backups who ascend or whatever, there is more incentive to get them early. And if the draft room is hot and heavy after them, I actually don't think this draft room was that bad. This one showed some restraint in terms of the pace of quarterback drafting. Yeah. But like just look at how many are gone by round 7 and 8. Like in round 8, we're looking at Winston, Goff, Darnold, Derek Carr, Cam Newton. Like
it is rough out there at that
Winston
point.
And Cam might not even have jobs all year. Or even to start the year. We don't know. And so, like, if that's what you have to do with the quarterback position in round 8, like, maybe it is worth just, like, hammering 2, maybe even 3 guys in the first 6 to 7 rounds in every one of these leagues. I think there's something to be said about getting that safety for yourself and also about taking away quarterback options from the other drafters in the room, because all you're trying to do is beat these 11 people. We're not talking about this in a tournament setting for best ball. When we're trying to win one league, if we make the other teams worse, that's okay for us, even if like our construction isn't ideal. And I think that either with a shotgun spread on tight ends, like we saw Jeff do, or with a shotgun spread on late wide receivers, like we see the person in the 3-hole do, like just getting those 3 quarterbacks early might be worth it if you can find the right players at those deeper positions or the positions that maybe tight end isn't deep, but the more generic positions, the positions where there's more replaceability in the middle to late tiers or similarity in the middle to late tiers.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And from a building block perspective, we can see kind of how like those approaches kind of play out in that perspective, like seeing like how team 3 wound up formulating their team. I mean, not completely off, but let's say instead of Cooper Kupp, like they took from me personally, I would have preferred like Tyler Lockett over Cooper Kupp, but that obviously makes sense since we drafted Tyler Lockett. But just like a guy that week in and week out, we know those targets going to be there. The touchdowns are probably going to be the spike weeks are going to be there to kind of hold, like to be like the wide receiver 1 for your group. And then after that, Pittman, Mooney, T.Y. Hilton, Amon-Ra St. Brown, like so on and so forth. So I get the approach. It's just trying to find the right players that fit that strategy can sometimes be difficult to do.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so that does it for this episode of Best Ball Live. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This has been a lot of fun. Chris, I want to thank you for taking the time to draft this team with me. I think that we have a good squad. This is not something that I would have typically drafted. Like, there are a lot of players here who are not my guys necessarily. Like Mahomes, number 2 overall, is not something I would normally do. I probably would have taken Aaron Jones over Cam Akers. Let's see, like Zach Moss is not a guy I draft very often, but I like the picks. I like the way the roster came together. Again, the construction makes sense to me. Probably my biggest regret is that we didn't stack more, but we also talked about how that can be okay. But yeah, anyway, why don't you let people know where they can find you, what you're working on, what to expect over the offseason here.
You can find me on Twitter at Chris Allen FFWX. I'm still doing some best ball work over at 4for4. But along with that, getting back to my roots. So the FFWX, the WX is for weather. I've been doing like some like short series and research on that over the past couple of years, like over at 4for4. Do have some more data that I've analyzed, kind of looking at the impacts of weather over some advanced metrics, so like EPA per play, completion percentage over expected CPOE, and how that affects gameplay, neutral passing rates, things of that nature. So finishing up the data analysis, like right now, should have a couple of articles out over the next couple of months before we really head into the thick of draft season. So catch me over at 4for4, and for the most part, that's where I'll be throughout the rest of the offseason.
Do you have any kind of sneak peeks on the weather front? Any findings that kind of stood out to you on your preliminary looks at this stuff? Anything you want to tease for those articles that are upcoming?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that I was able to find was that it's really just trying to dispel just the general narratives that it comes with that comes with weather. So just like the general things, like if it's super windy, they're going to wind up running more, or like there's not going to be too many deep passes. It's trying to just dispel a lot of just the general general rules that most folks that have had over the years, and just trying to say, well, here are the thresholds that we really need to start looking at. And that's where digging into the numbers, that's kind of what's led me to look at, 20 miles an hour or more. Okay, that's where you can start to raise your eyebrows, but then it's still over on a case-by-case basis. Even with rain, it's more like it's not that just that it's raining, but how much is it raining? So we need to look at precipitation rates. I've even looked at like stadium design, like how tall stadiums are to serve as like natural barriers for wind as well.
So it's just common wind directions too, right? Like if it's typically blowing in from the east or the south or whatever, depending upon the geography. Yeah, that's cool, man. I can't wait to read those articles.
Yeah, so I'm putting all that stuff together right now. So yeah, over the next month to 6 weeks, you'll see me rolling out bits and pieces as I'm finding them.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Here on the Best Ball Live front, as Sal noted in the chat, Best Ball Live is coming back tomorrow, 4 p.m. Eastern, with James Coe and John Daigle of NBC Sports Edge. They're going to be drafting a $5 underdog draft. And then on Friday, Sal and I are taking the trip over to the NBC stream with John, Mr. Daigle, and we're going to be drafting another one of these Superflex best balls with him and Ian Hartz, if I'm not mistaken. Looking forward to that. I will be back again on Best Ball Live next week with Anthony Amico. That will be on Tuesday, June 22nd. And that draft might start half an hour earlier at 9 p.m. Again, assuming it fills on time. We'll go through that struggle yet again. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Greg Sauce. Follow 4for4.com at 4for4football. Follow Chris at Chris Allen FFWX. Keep an eye out for the 2QB's draft guide, which is coming up later this offseason, which will help prepare you for this type of format, for Superflex, for 2QB. Chris, you're contributing to that, aren't you?
Yes, sir. I will be writing for it. Once Sal hit me up and asked me to come and contribute, how could I say no?
Yeah, I mean, when he approached me about it and said, "Hey, do you want to do this again?" I was like, you know what? I think I do. Had this baby ready to kind of get back into the 2QB world.
Get the band back together. Let's do some 2QB stuff.
Absolutely. We're doing it. I really need to kind of get into high gear on that. There's a lot of stuff left to do for it, but we're going to get it done. I'm really excited to be releasing that eventually. So keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, remember that if you go to 4for4.com and you subscribe, you will get a free voucher to use at the FFPC. So this draft that we just did, the Superflex Best Ball Slim, you can use that $35 voucher to use on one of those. You could do one of their 28-round Superflex drafts that include kicker and defense. You could do one of the 1QB drafts that Chris is an expert in, thanks to all his research over at 4for4.com. So get subscribed at 4for4. Use that voucher to dominate one of these best ball leagues. Chris, thank you again for taking the time. Really appreciate it. Anything else you want to say before we sign off?
Now, thanks for having me on. I mean, it's so good to actually see you and actually talk with you again. I mean, it's been an absolute blast. Thanks for everybody in the chat. Good seeing folks like ZK, Sal. I mean, everybody else that's in the chat. Thanks to everybody for coming out. And I mean, yeah, but all love to you, man. I really do appreciate you bringing me back. Good to see you making content again, man.
Yeah, we'll do it again at some point in the future. I can't wait. But yeah, thanks to Chris. Thanks to all you for tuning in. Tune in again tomorrow, and then again next week with me on Tuesday and Anthony Amico. Until then, adios.